A warm welcome. I think we can get started. Welcome to this conference on the impact of the national provincial elections of May 2024 on intergovernmental relations. Good to see you here, those of us who are here in the room with us, and we've got about 40 people joining us online. So it's great to have you, and a warm welcome. My name is Jaap De Visser. I am the South African Research Chair in Multilevel Government, associated with the Dullah Omar Institute here at the University of the Western Cape. So we've got a fascinating program ahead of us with some very esteemed speakers, and interesting perspectives will be discussed. Program will run until about 12 o'clock, so we'll finish a bit earlier. There won't be like a dedicated tea break in between, but feel free to duck out and grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea if you want to. And then around about 12 o'clock we should be wrapping up. So the upcoming elections. Everyone is talking about it. It is the talk of the day. People are performing polls, and polls are giving us predictions, and other people are disagreeing with those polls and saying those predictions are wrong. And then there's another poll that uses another methodology, and then further predictions are made. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but that's the nature of elections. Every party believes that it will gain an outright majority in all provinces and national government. And I do not make any predictions. I'm not in the business of making predictions. There are people who are much better at that than I am. I do know one thing, namely that they cannot all be right. So there is going to be some winners and losers. That's the nature of elections. There's also a good chance that not all provinces will be governed by one party, and that party may not be the same as the party or political formation that runs a national government. We simply don't know. There are many scenarios that may unfold, and some of them will surely be also discussed today. Most of the focus, of course, has been on the question, who will govern where, in which province, national government, or who will govern with whom, where, in which province or national government. And we want to shift the attention a bit differently, and to shift the attention to how will all of this affect intergovernmental relations. So a slightly more mundane, perhaps, angle, looking at once these governments have been elected, 9 provincial governments, provincial legislatures, the National Assembly, governments will be formed, how will they relate to one another? Given the fact that it's not unlikely that we will have political differences across national, provincial, and also local government, how will those elected governments relate to one another? Now, when I teach introduction to decentralization, and perhaps the minister still remembers this lecture, I hope she does. One of the things I talk about is the values of decentralization. There are lots of negatives, there's lots of complexities, there's lots of frustrations around decentralization. It's a difficult system of different levels of government and different governments elected at different levels, but there's also values to be had from decentralization. And one of the values is that decentralization has great potential to foster tolerance in a multi-party democracy. Why is that? Because in a system of decentralization, there can be multiple winners. Because you have different elections at different levels of government, potentially producing different outcomes. So it's not a zero-sum game politically, because you can win a city and at the same time lose at a provincial level, or you can win at national government level, you can lose in a province. All kinds of permutations are possible, so there are multiple winners. It's not like in many countries around us on the continent, the case where all the attention, all the focus is on that one office. I need to get hold of that one office in the capital. If I have that, then I have everything. Our system works differently because there's different things to be had at different levels of government, different spheres of government. So there are multiple winners. It's not a zero-sum game. With that comes also the tolerance for different political parties governing different governments at different levels or spheres of government. And we see that here in South Africa. And it's actually one of the stories I often tell when I'm abroad about the value of decentralization and what it has done for South Africa is, yeah, we happen to have a situation where 1 out of the 9 provinces is not governed by the same party that runs the national government. We have a number of cities, municipalities that are run by political parties or political formations that are not the same as the province within which they are located, or not the same as national government. And you know what? It's okay. It works. When in 2006, for the first time perhaps, a number of metropolitan municipalities, the ANC lost its majority there. Some of us were like very anxious, like, what's going to happen? Is the sky going to fall down? And you know what? It didn't. The sky didn't fall down. There was no mayhem. There was no riots in the streets. There was no flood of litigation. There was no such mayhem. It doesn't mean that it's all rosy. Of course, there's bickering, there's disagreements, there is also some litigation, and there is all of that. But I always make the argument that that's done within the rules of the game, and that is something that I think we should cherish, and we should actually be proud of, particularly on this continent where that kind of scenario often gives rise to political tension that boils over into much greater difficulty, sometimes even violence, or a central government squeezing a city of funding because it can do so. And in our system, that didn't work. The city of Cape Town, the city of Johannesburg, the city of Tshwane, all the municipalities, the Western Cape provincial government, it receives its intergovernmental funding as does any other subnational government, because the system is robust, the system is resilient. So far we've been doing fairly okay when it comes to intergovernmental relations across political lines. By the way, we invited the Western Cape government to attend. We tried almost all the MECs, and they honestly could not make it. I have to make that point, not because they didn't want to come or for any other reason. They have a cabinet meeting this morning, so they honestly couldn't attend. So it was just the timing wasn't right for them. But we will have more events, talking about similar issues. So we will make sure to have them in future. But I am convinced that would have loved to be present, to take part in this conversation. Now, when you talk about intergovernmental relations, this slightly boring topic of how do governments relate to one another, it's useful to make a distinction between 2 types of intergovernmental relations. There's one that I call is the soft edge of intergovernmental relations and the hard edge. The soft edge is when cities, provincial governments, national government departments relate to one another actually as equals, potentially as equals. There's not one level of government that is the boss of the other. They plan together, they budget together, they negotiate, they do projects together, they avoid disputes, they meet in intergovernmental meetings where, in principle, they meet as equals. And I think on that front, our system has been quite resilient, well-designed and resilient. And I'll give you one example. A number of months ago, the Western Cape government declared an intergovernmental dispute. It said in public, the provincial minister of finance, that we declared an intergovernmental dispute, endorsed by the premier, Alan Winder, saying the wage deal that was negotiated by the central government with the unions is unworkable for us. It's too expensive. You've negotiated salaries with officials that we have to pay, that is unaffordable for us as a province. So we declare an intergovernmental dispute. It didn't make headlines, but it was a big issue because we were talking about billions. It was a big financial problem that the Western Cape provincial government raised and elevated to the level of an intergovernmental dispute. This is now intergovernmental relations going to a head. As a public, we didn't hear too much about it because what then happens is that behind the scenes, the system of intergovernmental relations starts working and people start meeting, negotiating, probably in the Budget Council, the Budget Forum, intergovernmental forums, where the leaders of provinces meet with the leaders of the national government. And the outcome, at least for us as the public, not being on the inside, was that when the budget was introduced, accommodation was made for this issue. And some additional money was set aside for provinces to be able to afford the wage agreements that the national government had negotiated. And this is how intergovernmental relations actually works at its best, without too much fanfare, without too much hullabaloo. One subnational government raising an issue pointedly and saying this is really important for us and we want to declare an intergovernmental dispute, and then behind the scenes there's the massaging, the negotiating that happens. So that's perhaps an example of how it worked well. Now there's also the other part of intergovernmental relations, which is what I call the hard edge, which is when there is hierarchy, when one level of government or sphere of government is the boss of the other. For example, when a municipality does not perform, fails to deliver basic services, the provincial government or sometimes even the national government can intervene and march in and say, we're going to take over this place because you are running it into the ground. We are dissolving the council or we are appointing an administrator. So that is the hard edge of intergovernmental relations, where we're not talking about equals, but we're talking about one sphere of government being the boss of the other. And there are other elements of that in our system. And I would argue, and it's interesting to hear from the panelists, that there we have a bit more problematic examples, where we have interventions in municipalities, where there's been allegations of bias and prejudice. You're doing this simply because we're not belonging to the same political party that you are belonging to. We've had some court cases, constitutional court judgment in the intervention of Gauteng into the city of Tshwane, where the constitutional court almost intimated that, well, this intervention, you used your powers, but we sort of suspect there were some ulterior motives there, and that you don't really like this city because it is run by a political party that's not the same as yours. And we have a number of other examples in the area of the hard edge of intergovernmental relations, where national is the boss over provinces and provinces is the boss over local government, where I think we could have done better. And when the animosity between political parties, political formations, actually got in the way of good intergovernmental relations. Now, lastly, before I start introducing our panelists, there's now a new dimension that's coming in. Because so far we could have been talking about intergovernmental relations as in a government that is formed by a political party that is negotiating or engaging in relationships with another government which is formed by another political party. But now we have the possibility of coalitions, where the government that is formed within a province, or within a city, or perhaps even in national government, has its own internal divisions, because it's not necessarily a government that is run by one political party. We have all been talking about the possibility of that happening in one or two or multiple provinces, and even the possibility of that being a scenario that needs to unfold at national level. So then when you negotiate across governmental lines, across spheres of government, you're not necessarily negotiating with a partner who has a very solid political backing, because the premier of the province who needs to attend the meeting with the president to talk about issues of common interest, that province or that premier, him or herself, may be hanging on by a thread. He or she may not know whether by the end of the meeting with the president, he or she is still the premier, because we have this fluidity in these coalitions and these motions of no confidence that can unseat, we know they can unseat mayors. Are they going to unseat premiers? And what does that do to the functionality of these relationships across provinces and across cities and national government? So that's a further layer of complexity that is going to be very important to manage, because it has an impact on the functionality of relations across spheres of government. So we're going to delve into all of these issues with our excellent panel. I will introduce them one by one so that we can really focus on the person in front of us and know who is here with us. But of course, we have to acknowledge the presence of Minister Nkadimeng, who very kindly agreed to join us. Minister, warm welcome to you. Wonderful to have you. We're very grateful that you were willing to come, and we very much look forward to hearing your input in a few moments. But before that, we're going to listen to Prof. Tinashe Chigwata, who's going to give us a short introduction into some of the key questions and trends in intergovernmental relations. So Tinashe is Associate Professor and Head of the Multilevel Government Unit at the Dullah Omar Institute. I have the pleasure of working with him very closely on a daily basis to do the work on multi-level government that we do at the Dullah Omar Institute. He has a PhD in public law from UWC and also a master's from the Institute. He teaches in the master's and the postgraduate diploma. Students know him very well as the person that manages the two programs very, very competently. Has a lot of international experience, consulting, teaching, research, and someone that adds tremendous value to the work that we do at the Institute on multi-level government. So, Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jaap De Visser, for that elaborate introduction. Let me start my brief remarks by just saying that this morning when I arrived at the Institute, as I was walking in the corridors, I came across a quote. I think since those who have been at the Institute, you see that as you walk through, you see some quotes from famous contributors to South Africa's democracy, including R.B. Sachs and many others. And I came across one of the quotes by Bulelani Ngcuka. And if you may allow me, I'm just going to read that to you. And I quote, "We wanted to come up with a constitution that will serve us well when we are in opposition, because when you are in power, you hardly need the law to protect you. You need the law when you are out of office. So we must come up with a constitution that will save the people of South Africa even when they are not in government." So that was Bulelani Ngcuka several years ago. This is not to say that the ANC is going to be out of government, but simply to say that when you design institutions, when you adopt constitutions, you don't do so only with the interest of the citizens of today. You're also looking at tomorrow, of what could happen tomorrow. And today, the question that we're asking ourselves is, the system of intergovernmental relations is entrenched in the South African Constitution, resilient enough to deal with potential challenges that could emerge after the May national and provincial elections? So this is the main question that we are asking ourselves today, that we hope we'll be able to find not all the answers, but begin that conversation around that topic. Why are we looking at this topic today? I think as Jaap has already, covered that enough, is that if you look at the public discourse or public debate, It is mostly about which political party is going to win at national elections, which are the mostly contested provinces, which political party is likely to go into a marriage with which political party, whether that marriage is going to be of inconvenience or not. So that's more the debate that you see that is dominating the public debate on elections. And our view is that we need to go beyond that and look at the potential impact of the electoral outcome on a number of issues. For example, the economy. In this case, we are looking at the potential impact of the elections on intergovernmental relations. And we're not going to predict, as Jaap said, who is going to win the elections, but it is interesting, I think very useful for us to see what the electoral outcome means for intergovernmental relations. And I think our experience from the local government level, there's a number of lessons that we can learn from there. So we know very well that these are provincial national elections, but local government is part of the same system. So there are a number of developments at the local government level that we can draw upon that are illustrative in as far as national and provincial levels of government are concerned. What we've seen over the past few years is that there's been a diversity of political parties at the local government level, particularly in larger cities. So a number of political parties are represented in the municipal councils. It's also public knowledge that there are continuous tussles for political power, either to gain or regain control of the council. So this is public knowledge as well. And as a result, the resilience of the local government system has been tested, where, for instance, a municipal council is unable to function because of the fact that political parties are unable to agree on who should be appointed, and the continuous motion of non-confidence that we see rampant in the local government sector. And there have been a number of proposals that have been put in place to try to find ways of restoring normality in the local government sector. So that diversity of political parties, particularly in the bigger cities, it is, I think, productive in as far as multi-party democracy is concerned, but it is quite clear that it comes with several challenges. Why is it useful to draw lessons from the local government system? The first point is that the political system is the same. So the same political parties that are participated in the previous local government elections that are in municipal council are also more or less the same political parties that are competing at the national and provincial elections. And as I already mentioned, local government does not function in isolation. It is also part of the same multi-level government system with national and provincial governments. So the question that we are asking, what form or shape will these challenges take at the provincial level in relation to cooperative and supervisory relations that the previous speaker alluded to? It is important to note that the South African, I think, system of government, the multi-level government system, is anchored on the principle of cooperative government. In the words of the Constitutional Court, in the first certification judgment, the court had this to say that cooperative government prefers political solutions to disputes rather than adversarial litigation. So if there are problems, if there are disputes between spheres of governments, we must find political solutions first before we can approach a court. What will happen if there are different political parties at different levels? We've already seen from the local government experience that it is difficult to find a political solution where there is political diversity among political parties. With the increased political diversity, the question that we are also asking today is, are we going to see competition consuming the intergovernmental relations space more than cooperative governance, depending on the outcome of the elections? What is the impact of intensified political competition on executive intergovernmental relations? How will structures such as the President's Coordinating Council and Minimex affected if there is increased political diversity at provincial, at national level? We are also asking ourselves questions regarding the role and functions of the National Council of Provinces. What does the intensified political competition mean for the NCOP? Will it change the relationship between the NCOP and the National Assembly? Will it change the way in which provinces arrived at mandates and have them represented in the National Council of Provinces? So these are some of the questions that we're asking when it comes to the NCOP. Professor Jaap has already, I think, made reference to the fiscal issues. We are also asking ourselves, what will be the impact on fiscal intergovernmental relations when we have a variety of political parties or diversity of political parties represented at provincial, at national level? Are we going to see increased contestation around how national raised revenue is shared and how intergovernmental grants are designed in general? Are we also going to see a change in relationship between the provincial and local relations, between the national and provincial relations, and between the national and local relations? Is it also possible to even imagine the fact that after the national and provincial elections, some of the loose coalition arrangements in the major cities may have to be renegotiated depending with the electoral outcome? Those are some of the questions that we are asking today. And overall, the main question is the intergovernmental system resilient enough to deal with whatever political changes that may occur after the May national and provincial elections? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tinashe, for that overview of the issues. We can now see that there are many facets and many dimensions to this question. This morning there was a report in a newspaper on the passing of the appropriation bill by the NCOP. So the National Council of Provinces passed the appropriation bill, and it was interesting to look at how the media reported on the passing, namely 7 provinces voted in favor, 1 province voted against, and we can sort of guess which province that was, and 1 province did not vote, did not manage to get its mandate passed or tabled in the NCOP. So it's an indication of how the NCOP, which we don't often see as a, it's not the site of hectic democracy. It's sort of a bit in the background. We don't often pay much attention to it. Think of scenarios after the elections. If things go the way some of the polls are suggesting, that kind of, patterns are going to be more and more prevalent. For example, will a provincial legislature that is run by a very fractured coalition, will it be able to formulate a mandate into the NCOP? And how will the voting patterns pan out in the NCOP? So anyway, we're trying to unpack some of these scenarios and think a bit more long-term about the effects of the diversification of our politics on intergovernmental relations. So in order to take this debate further, we're going to listen to Minister Thembi Nkadimeng, and after that we'll listen to Professor Steytler and Ms. Tessa Dooms, whom I will introduce when it's their turn to speak. So Minister Nkadimeng, I thought it would be interesting to mention, she really cut her teeth in politics, in student politics. As a member of COSAS and SASCO at the University of the North. She really learned, I suppose, the art of politics in student politics. So being at a university and is second nature for her. She has many academic achievements, a Bachelor of Arts, a higher education diploma, an honors in arts, a Bachelor in Philosophy, and a Management Advanced program from WITS. So a range of degrees that she has obtained. And she's well on her way to obtain a master's as well from this university. We still need to talk about how to take that forward, but at some point the president had other ideas, so it was slightly derailed, but we'll pick it up again. It's a long history in government as an official, also in the corporate sector, and then in 2014 became executive mayor of Polokwane in Limpopo, became president of SARChl, Deputy Minister of Cooperative Governance, and since 2023, She is our Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. So I invited her to speak as a minister, because this is the minister that's overseeing the entire system of intergovernmental relations, with all its political facets and dynamics in it. So we very much look forward to hearing your input. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let me also greet Prof. Steytler, Prof. Tinashe. There's quite a few of my colleagues here. Ladies and gentlemen, students, stakeholders in local government. Let me first appreciate the invitation, really, to the Dullah Omar Institute. It's a home for me, and I feel very much guilty when I can't accept an invitation. So I tried. Prof, Wednesdays are usually not a good day for government. That's just a tip for future. Okay, so I've missed 2 cabinet committees because I'm here. So all cabinets, whether provincial or national, they sit on Wednesday. So it's very relatively difficult to get hold of an MEC or a minister, or even a president on a Wednesday. It's not a good day. So in future, in the plan, you really have to move a mountain to get any of the above categories. So in a SARChl at national, when cabinet sit one Wednesday after the other, the Wednesday of today it's cabinet committees preparing for cabinet next week, which is a Wednesday. And the next Wednesday also is the one that prepares for the next. And I think in a provincial, they run relatively a system, though they will call them clusters in the province, and then the MEC, as in the provincial cabinet, sits on that Wednesday, and it rolls like that. So it's for the future. I think this conference presents an opportunity for all of us, really, beyond this room and discussion, to really take and look into what the future presents for us, prepare ourselves emotionally and otherwise, but also shape the landscape of what South Africa is to become. And Frantz Fanon puts it very well. We need to define what our future is. We need to make choices. And we need to be deliberate about our choices. I often say to people, success is it's intentional. You don't wake up and think you're going to win a comrades marathon if you haven't started the process and really be determined that when June comes, I'm going for the ultimate race. If you don't do that, it's not going to work out. Even when you have done it well this year, if you think with your preparation of this year you can run the marathon of 2025, you are out. So you have got to be consistent in how you are doing it. I like the topic as well, and I'm going to get directly into it. 2 questions in particular, for me at least, that are at the forefront of this discussion. How is the intergovernmental relations system tested when different parties or coalitions govern at a different level? And secondly, I want to look at how do we ensure that this system remain resilient enough to weather any political changes that may arise. I think Prof. Tinashe did touch on, currently, is it really resilient? Can it withstand the weather? And we see the inclement weather already that we are in. So I'll look into the first question. It has inherent complexities. Political power is dispersed, as we all know, among various parties, and we at least rely and has been proven to be correct in a system where at least our judiciary is intact. Is free to operate, is free to arrive at a decision that it is convinced are correct and are in the best interest of the citizens, living by the Bible, which is our constitution. So we're designed to promote IGR, generally cooperation and coordination amongst the three spheres of government. Formidable challenges if you look 20 years in local government, but also even beyond into both national and provincial government. So if you put the complexities of today, conflicting agendas, different priorities, divergent ideologies, the strain of the fabric of the IGR gets to be tested, and the system has been found to be bending and having it difficult. Some of the powers which we believe were inherent in the Constitution and not necessarily really determined, the province of the Western Cape wrote to the president and said, we won't do DDM. You've introduced district development model, you want one plans, we're not part of that. And Mpo Palatse, then the mayor of City of Johannesburg, wrote the same letter and said, Dear President, Honorable yourself, I'm not going to do a district development model, I'm not going to do your plan as you intend, so I'm not going to support. And coincidentally, the president had appointed ministers and deputy ministers to be champions in municipalities in line with the district development model. Myself, as a deputy minister then, and Thandi Mudise, if you will recall, were inaugurated at the same time. And amongst the areas which we were remaining in municipalities, we were both allocated to be champions of the city of Johannesburg. And in the district development model, which finds its cornerstone of existence on the IGR, it says the province and the municipalities must develop what we will call it one plan, which will inform one government, one plan, so that nationally and its fiscal can cascade into this one plan of development. So what does that mean? It means when you are sitting at ISA at an infrastructure developmental level and you don't have this plan, it means ultimately you don't have the proper baseline of that particular space in that particular local municipality. So planning will not be coordinated, and it is not. Well, the other party then came when Madame Palatse, and they quickly invited the champions and we started drafting the plan. And then another mayor came and I said, okay, can we see you and we brief you about the plan and whatever. That meeting has not yet happened. So those are the intricacies and the complexities. And it may be an extreme example because of the change of hands in terms of power, but it's a reality of what we're living under. And for me, what worries me more, at least about these realities, is that about 40 to 45% of our population in South Africa resides in metros. So if you don't get the metros right, it means half of your population is living in uncertainty. So what are the lessons that we have drawn from the 2021 local government elections? Year 2000, we started with about 24 hung councils. Now we're sitting at about 82. It's usually difficult to define it because there are by-elections, but we have hovered between 80 to 82 after the elections of 2021. And the challenges of coalitions are underestimated. Because what does the Constitution guarantee? We always focus on power dynamics and whatever. But for me, as a minister, the greatest test of coalitions is that they should deliver services to its people. It's a citizen's charter. For me, that's the greatest test. Honestly, whether it's a party yellow who's sitting and mayoring, it's very primary to me. But coalitions are consistent with lack of service delivery. Consistent. Since their inception. In fact, there's a small municipality out of interest, Prof, I think with time we must go and visit and just look. Abaqulusi in KZN is one small municipality that at some stage, national government and the IEC had to decide that, well, you guys can't agree who must govern you. Go back to elections. That's the only municipality in the country after they failed to even agree. Remember, the Constitution says in 14 days after elections, you must have your first council sitting. The MEC and minister can grant on request City of Johannesburg. I think when they elected their mayor, they were almost approaching day 120. So they really had tossing and turning. At that time, nothing is happening. You are drinking water by chance. Your waste is collected by chance. Any other thing that you think is of importance is happening on the autopilot to an extent that, yes, if a MM is there, what does your legislation say? There are some decisions which you can't arrive at because your legislation says they must be granted by council as a form of a release of that budget and authority. And to me, that's the greatest test. The rest, yes, we can, they may be not good for the image, for the decorum of council, if councillors are on top of the table. Well, but yes, but if there is no service consistently, then it creates a problem and it impacts negatively on political administrative interface, on reasoning, and on good governance, and on service delivery. So Abaqulusi couldn't, even after extensions and extensions, and IEC then had to say, look, in KwaZulu-Natal provincial government, go back to elections. That was not a dissolution. Go back to elections. Let's give the community another chance of deciding who must lead them, because we can't agree. And because it's a small municipality, it's often possibly not written about, not even mentioned, but we went into a situation like that. I don't hope in future we'll ever do that again, whether it's at the local municipality. So the framework which guides the formation of governance or party constitutionally, we may also have to relook into it. Yes, the system from a constitutional point of view, and actually in both Systems and Structures Act, is looking for a multi-party democracy, but I don't think we'd ever envisioned a real multifunctional democracy. So various stakeholders, including political parties, they've also agreed that we need to regulate coalitions, because no one seems to be enjoying, even political parties. Possibly at the beginning, it was more or less type of a game. But there's nothing as inconsistent. I mean, I came here for a debate. I was invited with the mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay. And sometimes when you are debating, a minister is seen as an ANC or a mayor is seen as a DA, even when it's not. And I kept on reminding him, you know, you won't be mayor next week. I said, let's just focus on doing work. Because I promise you, I think it is Odendal, I promise you, you won't be mayor next week. And if I keep on wearing a political hat, I will not run a single municipality. At least that is not coming from the party that I come from. And indeed, he wasn't mayor. He's still not mayor. I don't know what are they doing in Nelson Mandela Bay. They've got motions. This time they are in court. They are whatever. I received the letter. They are asking for a placement of a MM because the MM. So each and every mayor came with their own MM, with their own thing. And they don't spend anything because they don't get the time to talk about services. So I think that is what as COGTA were trying to do. And coincidentally, Prof, we went to Cabinet yesterday, a committee, and we placed the coalition bill draft. And we got the permission to go for public participation. And I think it will be a very nice As it gets released, which should be happening sometime next week or so through government gazette printers, then it will give us an opportunity on what are we dreaming about in what we have developed, this framework which arises from the IGR and influencing the Structures Act and the Systems Act as well. But the execution is more what drives us. What are the tendencies which we have learned also are important? Unscrupulous manipulation by small parties to have governance by a small unrepresentative group of individuals. And it has influenced us in the draft to put a threshold. Other parties argue a threshold of 1% is too minimal, but my argument is that at a starting point, you can't go higher. If you go to Denmark, they are at about 5% of threshold in terms of representation. We also need to understand that our communities themselves also need to understand the importance of democracy. The importance of how does democracy arise? It comes from a vote. If you look even today on the pie that the IEC has released, it's only about 52% or so of residents of South Africa who are registered. A whooping over 40% is not registered, which means they are not participating in democracy. And then they don't understand why they are all this, and they have to participate. Who they vote for is not a question. The question is the participation to determine what do you think is the future. And currently at the local government, and maybe, as I'm saying, designed by our forebears, the thought was really not drilled down. I mean, if you go and look into the CODESA documents and what was handed over in local government, it's 2 pages, and I'm not exaggerating. They possibly did not have time. They were done with national and provinces. They just drafted some small things. A transitional local council must be established to determine the local government, whatever, and they handed it over and they left. And Dade Bambo will tell you he's been in local government since TLCs. They left 2 pages. And the designing of the system really was more of what is working somewhere and you combined it and you put it. And this is a good 22 years or so of local government, which says we need to then be inward looking and deal with what we need to do. We're also saying those parties that are governing in a particular municipality must then deal with a citizens' charter and make it public. And the argument is the IDP not a citizens' charter? Is the IDP not public? Is the IDP? But let's go back to history. 2016, 2021, Nelson Mandela Bay had quite a number. Mayor Bobani, Mayor, the one who was coming from the DA, Trolip. They actually had about 5 mayors in that term, on that average. They spent not a single cent in a budget that they were allocated for 5 years to build houses. What happened? Money they got, beneficiaries are there, but no houses being bought. Because Mayor Trolip received the budget and started planning settlement A. You know, when you plan a settlement, you must design it. As he was busy doing that, he was removed. He didn't spend. The second mayor got in and started planning another settlement there. Where is the IDP in this instance? It means it becomes fluid on the change of hand. And if IDP is an engagement of a community, because remember, you don't dream an IDP. And we have a case, I think it's Matatiela municipality, which lost in its past time. It never had an IDP. It said, we believe that we know what are the needs of the community. And we decided not to hold the IDP, and we wrote these needs down, and we are implementing them. And they were taken to court by the community, and the community won. Because the IDP is informed by the needs of the community. And the community must be the one which forwards those needs. But they were forwarded in Nelson Mandela Bay. They were not honored. They were changed. So the question is, who has the right to change the IDP? So we should rather have a system which says IDP is a contract. Whether you call it a citizens charter, whether you call it a IDP, to me it's neither here nor there. But when we grant you as a mayor, we're not granting you a mayor. It's council which approves the IDP if you go to the Systems Act. And it's mandatory. It's the only part actually where a council is supposed to be 50+1 in majority to adopt that plan. And I think the reasoning was legitimate to such an extent that it doesn't look at the majority of the House sitting. It says if your council has 50 members, it means you need, if you have 100, you need 50+1, you need 51 members to adopt the budget and its IDP. And you can't change it without those numbers, even at the February time. But in coalitions, look at any other example, it changes. And we want that to be legislated. Well, in fighting, I don't promote it. We have released the code of conduct. And out of interest, Prof, the first after the release, the city of Tshwane was the first to have a council fiasco. Where you will recall there was a DA guy whose shirt was torn and openly so. And they negotiated, I called the speaker, I said, Speaker, I hope I will see action according to the code. He said, no, Minister, we decided to talk as parties. So they didn't execute the code. What is this inability to adopt budgets and service delivery because council doesn't sit, because they gag one another? And some of you think when it's not in a coalition, everything is hunky-dory. No, I'll give an example of a province where I come from, where a district couldn't adopt his budget, and all of them, councillors, come from one party almost. One party. And there were factional tendencies. And when my supporters come, Prof supporters don't come, and we don't form a quorum. And we don't adopt a budget. And when your supporters come, mine don't come deliberately, and we don't form a quorum. And we come from one party. So we need to tighten the system, not because it's of coalitions only. It's actually even worse in some instances where they come from the same party. You go and look into KwaZulu-Natal now. They are the worst ones because they also even believe in elimination. If you don't agree with the budget, you just get killed outside. And the story continues. So it even gets worse in other areas. On the second question, how do we fortify? Well, there's quite a number of things you can do. Capacity building. It's one of the things. Enhancing communication, transparency. But for me, it's a government Bible that needs to guide the direction of what government intends to implement. I get fascinated by almost all governments at all spheres. Going to China, you get a mayor, I'm going to China. You get an MEC, I'm going to China. A minister, I'm going to China. Okay, it's all right. But what are the lessons have we learned? They implement infrastructure both to enhance socially and economically what they will call their service delivery improvement model based on infrastructure, and it's a Bible. That is why when they've decided they want to build a mall here, they're developing a city here, everyone joins in. What are the best examples we have? And the system doesn't allow you. What are the best examples we have of IGR in South Africa? 2010 was the best. The World Cup was the best. The president then established teams where everyone, from national, provincial, local, the cities, My city at the time, Polokwane, National gave us no chance. City of Cape Town was saying, we don't want a stadium. We said, thou shalt have it. It's because it was not necessarily in the interest of the city, it was in the interest of the people and the country. That's what China does best. You can't stand in the way of development against the people for your own not tested intentions. So we don't do that very well. If you go to Limpopo today, you go and travel on the R37. National was given a task to coordinate provincial roads which have got a national, you could say developmental agenda into it. If you know Mpumalanga, you will know they've got the 3 mountains leading to the Kruger National Park and whatever. And the instruction of National was transfer those roads to Sanral. Limpopo transferred the road. Mpumalanga refused to transfer the road. Sanral has concluded the road on the part of. So when you finish on Mpumalanga side heading to the Kruger National Park, you're traveling on a national road. Beautiful. When you get into Mpumalanga, where this drive is economically and in a tourism perspective, you are just greeted by potholes. Who's running who? You need a Bible that will be non-negotiable at the IGR level. That is why we find it more difficult today to build a dam. Think of what Umzimvubu and its agreement or government adopting that a dam is needed there for everybody to have water in the Eastern Cape. And then we have to talk to a small municipality which says, no, I don't think I'm ready for this dam, or do this dam if you do it according to my terms. Who must listen to who? It's a very fundamental question. You can't stop a development of a country and its people because minutely you have, yes, consultation, it's important, collaboration, but there has to be a point where it says, this is a direction, this is beneficial. If you were to think about the expansion now, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal of the, is it N2? Yes, N2. If there could be the mayor of OR Tambo who says, no, you have not consulted me, President, this freeway can't be done. And people have to go all the other way around because a particular part of the sphere of government says, no, it can't be done without me. I don't think we'll be leading the people of South Africa. And there's quite a number of these examples. And the greatest test for me is not who leads, is what is important and liberating to the people. And if we can learn that, I guess we could. I watched on television yesterday, this fire which happened here in Philippi, one of our areas to determine and classify disaster, around 117 shacks, 200 plus people displaced. Okay, the province says, no, it's within our mandate to do this. Just give us the money. And Human Settlement says, we have a centralized budget. Who's going to suffer? Is those people we must build and put houses for, as we are talking, they are outside. So there has to be somewhere where you say, this is a test, and this is the main beneficiary of this IGR. And as I'm saying, you shouldn't think it's only happening on opposition. It will be wrong for me to make that assumption. But the president has established the IMC for elections, headed by ourselves, Cogta and Home Affairs. And the greatest test for me and Minister Mtsoaledi is that we need, one, to form consultation within the parties to make sure that at least we put systems that are agreeable. IEC is part of the stakeholders that we are convening, and a roadmap that will take us to what seems to be difficult elections. And they're not difficult for which party must win. The greatest test is for us to put free and fair elections on the table, that you will feel safe to walk and leave your house to go to a polling station, because we have coordinated things in such a way that they are, you feel free in your country, you feel free to go and exercise your right. you are not scared as to whether you are seen. You feel free to associate if you want to associate with a particular formation that you truly believe in for your own good reasoning. So at the heart of Section 41, the highlights are the continuous interaction and cooperation between governmental institutions and departments. But in recognition of the interdependence of this sphere, each sphere possesses its own distinct powers, functions, and institutions. And we have to respect that. Yet, we need to understand that they are inherently interconnected. There's no sphere. Hence, all development happens in a ward, in a particular municipality somewhere. So whether it's a school or a police station, it may not necessarily be a purview of a mayor to deal with those, but they happen. And he or she has a role in allocating whether space, bulk, infrastructure, and all that, even for national programs to attend. So regardless of the electoral outcomes, I believe it is important for all political parties to adhere to the spirit of cooperative government and intergovernmental relations. Maybe the other question which we ask ourselves should be, is it necessary for us to have intergovernmental relations? Can't we shape a system in such a way that it's a free run flow? I don't think we should. The fabric of democracy and the choices that were made, I think they're still correct, and I think it's possible for people to work together, or the spheres to work together and be harnessed, because the backbone will be the democratic governance and a facilitating approach that comes with cooperation and coordination. So we're emphasizing that it must continue and there must be stability in governance. We're also thinking through the instrument of DDM, it can create the Bible. Yesterday, ISA launched the infrastructure handbook with the president here at Century City. And if that infrastructure Bible, we believe is a catalytic to economic development in the country, then all of us, if we're interested in job creation and employment, we should partner in that handbook, in the way in which our affairs are structured to unlock the problem. And thirdly, we must also build, as I had said, institutional capacity. Of interest, Minister Godongwana, when we were reviewing, as we still are, the fiscal formula for municipalities, says to me, Minister, I do believe your CFOs are not properly qualified. As we do this, let's run an audit. I said, no, it's fine. I don't believe so, but yeah, let's. So we developed a questionnaire. We said, attach all your finance, give us your structure, which position is filled, and attach their curriculum. 97% are qualified. In fact, almost half are chartered accountants, registered to the Chartered Accountant Board of South Africa. So why there's lack of accountability? Is there no desire to do the right thing? It's not about a capacity. So we also need to assess this capacity. Maybe I said to Minister Godongwana, the next test should be at an infrastructure level. We need to go and do the same and say to all municipalities, you have got a problem of running and spending your budget, and the key driver of basic services, the infrastructure unit. Maybe let's go down, drill, and look into this capacity at infrastructure. I think we've spoken a lot about capacity. Yes, there are areas where there isn't capacity sufficiently, or there is a mismatch in capacity. But I also think when we do not want to really unpack what are the challenges, we just say there's no capacity. There's no capacity, and then we outsource. So the next question which we then send to the municipality, and I doubt they will respond, was, then if you have a chartered accountant, why do you hire a consultant to do your annual financial statements? Because you have got a man and a woman who knows how to do it. Why are you outsourcing? So I say to Minister Godongwana, I doubt we'll get responses here, but let's do it. Because that's where we need to go. If the AG says 60% warm bodies, 60% outsourcing, there's something not right. It's either we pay someone external, we do away with the internal position. And then we come, we say, there's no money in local government. Story for another day. Prof, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. That was really insightful. Debunking some of the myths around capacity and coordination, and also being quite upfront and saying, well, IGR, difficulties in IGR is not just about opposition versus ruling party. Within the same political formation, there can be the same tensions or sometimes even worse. And I think you highlighted the resistance against cooperation for sometimes quite sort of selfish political reasons, and that you can't fix with an IGR system. That is really about the predisposition of individuals in the system and the interests that they promote. And that ultimately, if things do not work, if cooperation fails, it's not just a system failure. It's beneficiaries that suffer. It's people on the ground, people that are supposed to benefit from services, basic services, are deprived of essentially of dignity. So IGR is not just, as I indicated in the beginning, maybe a mundane issue of government functionality. It really is in the end about the dignity of people that are entitled to good governance and basic service delivery. Right, let's move along to the next input, and feel free to take a quick leg stretch if you want to stretch your legs and walk out for a cup of coffee. Again, that is fine, but we're going to move on to Professor Nico Steytler to give his perspective on this topic. He's a former South African Research Chair in Multilevel Government, my predecessor, who I'm very honored to step into his shoes and take over the chair from him. Also the former director of the Community Law Center, former member of the Financial and Fiscal Commission, of the Municipal Demarcation Board. There are too many accolades, bells and whistles and medals to mention. Professor Steytler is he's an icon in the field of multi-level government, not just in South Africa, but also abroad. A wealth of experience, practical, academic. So we very much look forward to listening to you. Prof. Nico, over to you.
Right. Minister, thank you for a very enlightening and I would also say sobering input here about the difficulties that we do face. I particularly liked your opening remarks about success. And success is like marathon running. It's planning, it's discipline. And it reminds me of an engagement I had with Trish Hanekom. She was MEC for probably planning in Gauteng. And she, with a debate with her husband, Derek, said, well, I like to appoint comrades. And we said, well, is that cadre deployment? She says, no. It is comrades who have finished the comrades. Because that's, and she was pointing at a CFO at that time, and she said, that means a guy who planned a year ahead to be able to run 89 kilometers, who were then disciplined. Planning is wonderful. You can do it in a day. Yes, I can run the comrades, but it is then the discipline of every day going out and building your capacity. So I said, yeah, good. Point count comrades, not cadres. So a lot of common ground has been covered by the speaker so far. And maybe sort of repeating somewhat, but let's get some basic facts out. We all agree that service delivery in the country depends on all three levels of government working together. And the very essence of our system of governments is the concurrency of powers. No one has exclusive powers except the national government on a range of issues, but most of the services that we think of are concurrent, which then adds the rider. Yes, we have concurrency of powers, and that requires cooperative government. And so we have a system dependent upon cooperation, and the Constitution provides for that, as I'll come in a moment. Second fact is what is known is why this interest in the election this year is the fact of the possibility of coalitions. Big news, and let me put it straight, is that the ANC, according to predictions, will not get 50%. For the national election, that is to be seen. There's polls and polls, as Jaap was telling us. The day comes on the 29th of May, we will know. But coalition, possibly at national level, certainly at some provinces. So the predictions go. The third fact is that our experience of coalition government at local level has not been good. It's not been edifying. Political stability, and as the minister even adds, it's even intra-parties, political instability. And as the minister also explained very graphically, the impact on service delivery is dramatic. You can't build a single house in Nelson Mandela Bay for a 5-year period of political instability of coalitions. You forgot Daniel John as a mayor there as well. And then afterwards, changing coalitions and so forth. But the hard reality is not a single house were built, they were planned, no budget spent, and so on. And that's the problem that we have experienced. And further fact is the difficulties of coalitions that they are not built on policy agreements, coalition agreements. That is to say that parties come together, do we have agreement on what we are collectively going to do? The agreement is usually who gets which post. It's a carving up of the cake, not what we're going to serve. And so the concerns of our past experience are now being also projected onto the future. And that's the difficulty. So the questions that we need to address is how may coalitions governments affect the country as a whole? Governance in the country is important, and we have some inclination of that already. And then secondly, is our system of intergovernmental relations resilient and robust enough to ensure effective and efficient government? There are the big questions. So, on political fluidity in 2024, as I said, it may be the end of ANC hegemony if its support falls below 50 at the national level, and then also in some provinces. At the moment, 8 of the 9 provinces are governed by the ANC. So the predictions is that particularly Gauteng and KZN, there may not be an ANC majority, and even in the Western Cape, the DA, some polls now say, will not get 50%. So it's going to be then at least 3 provinces. There may be fluidity in the coalitions. So the result will be coalition governments at national and provincial governments. Hopefully there will be formal agreements, coalition agreements, and this is something that Professor De Visser and his team has been working on at local government, is how do you actually get an agreement? The other problem is if there's no agreement, we get the phenomenon of what I called inchoate coalition governments, minority governments. So you never get an agreement between parties, an alliance. You get a minority party, but the biggest party, and then has to bargain each time there is to be a vote, whether it's the budget, whether it's this or that. So it becomes a fluid system. When will there be a majority or not? And I like to see our expert sitting here that we can also draw on. Jessica. Right. So as I said, it is new territory for us of the country, whereas in the past we had the hegemony of the ANC providing some level of stability, and also in terms of the IGR system, is you work also the unruliness of your party through the party structures. And you can have relations between the various levels within the party to ensure that there is alignment. So, what are the consequences if there is this change in power? So, political differences between the national government and the provinces, whoever gets the national. So there's contestation. In the past, as Jaap explained, there was the Western Cape, the DA in the Western Cape and the ANC at national. And then also, if provinces changes hands and different coalitions, there are differences between them, provincial governments and municipalities. Another place where there could be consequences is the National Council of Provinces that Jaap alluded to. Provinces need to elect delegations. I'll come back to that in a moment, how that will be effective. And then the impact on local government itself. Now, already we've got hung councils. Jaap, you don't like word hung councils. You can explain in a moment why not. But there are 81 or 82 coalition governments, or where there is not a majority already at the metros. What happens if now at a national level or at a provincial level there is a different coalition partners? Will that filter down to the local existing coalitions, or is that also going to unscramble local currently operating arrangements? Okay. Now, the impact on IGR, we've had some wonderful illustrations given by the Minister. So, at the legislative level, it may in fact impact on how the NCOP will function. At the executive level, executive IGR, how the structured IGR instruments or structures will function. The President's Coordinating Council, the MINMEX, the District Development Model, which was already been mentioned. At provincial level, the Premier's Coordinating Forum, and the notion, the IGR notion, cooperative government notion, is of avoiding litigation in solving disputes. Are we going to see how a way in which disputes have been resolved? And Jaap gave an example of the Western Cape on that, on the issue of finances. Will that tradition or way of doing it be changed? So, what is the framework, the constitutional framework in which this new political dispensation, and we don't know how new or how it's going to be, but say it's going to be different. How is it going to fit into the existing system? And we go back to the grassroots, the Bible, the Constitution, which tells us that the obligation flowing from the principles of IGR is to secure the well-being of the people of the Republic. It is the focus on the beneficiaries, on the people who wants service delivery, not necessarily who's the party going to rule, but the basics of life. So secure the well-being of the people is the goal which which government must be committed. And then secondly, and I quote here from section 41 of the Constitution, is to provide effective, transparent, accountable, and I emphasize, coherent government. That you are not at odds with one another. You can't build a dam because one municipality would like to have a different one or have a different contractor build a dam, etc. So that's a key part of the guiding principles. It is the notion of coherence. IGR, however, in the Constitution is premised on the fact that there will be a multi-party political system and that parties will differ at different levels. But given that differences, cooperation still should be the name of the game. So if you just look at the Constitution, in how Parliament functions, you write into the Constitution a mediation committee to resolve conflicts between the National Assembly and the NCOP. Now, that was, as Bulelani Muka said, rules for all times, is there could be a difference. So you provided for differences of opinion between two institutions, the two houses of Parliament. And at executive level, the duty to cooperate with each other in mutual trust and good faith by, and I emphasize the first paragraph there, fostering friendly relations. Now, that means that you are, if they're all in the same party, I'm sure that the friendly relations exist, but here it's the notion of you build friendly relations. Now we have a situation where political parties are demonizing each other as the worst possible outcomes for the country. And then afterwards, if they are institutionalized through the vote, they will have to work to each other and foster friendly relations. So the movement from demonization to fostering friendly relations in coalitions between parties, between levels of party, is a big challenge. So here is a IGR framework premised on the basis that there will be political differences. So this is not new. This is the founding mothers and fathers of the Constitution thought the system will work. And now it's going to be okay, are you following me? I'm not signaling you. Okay. Now, let us look at the next slide. National Council of Provinces, the stepchild of Parliament. And it was the stepchild of Parliament because there was always alignment between the National Assembly, dominated by the ANC, and the NCOP, where 8 of the 9 delegations were ANC. So, to my recollection, there was only once a vote against a bill adopted by the National Assembly, and that was the traditional courts bill. Only once. So for the past, since 1997, we 25 years over, we have had a harmonious relationship, but it was within the party. Now, the NCOP therefore didn't come to its own. But it has important powers. It co-determines matters affecting legislation, affecting provinces. There you have to get 5 out of the 9 votes, a majority. It must approve constitutional amendments, 6 out of the 9 delegations, approval of international treaties, 5 out of the 9, approval of national and provincial interventions in provinces and local government respectively, and approval of other bills not affecting provinces or local government, where the delegates suddenly are turned into individuals and they can vote according to their party line, which are not in terms of their dominant party, the mandate given by the provincial legislature to them. And this is in contrast about the delegations and mandates. Now, each province sends a delegation of 10 persons to the NCOP. So each delegation has got 1 vote, and this delegation must be representative of the provincial legislature. If the ANC is the majority, there will be a majority ANC, and in the delegation. Now, each provincial legislature then formulates the mandate that must be presented in the NCOP. And if the majority ANC in a province, the majority party will then also formulate the mandate, how the province should vote in respect of legislation or a decision. Now, when the bill affecting provincial interests is passed to the National Assembly, in the National Assembly, it's sent to the NCOP. The NCOP sends that bill to the provincial legislature. The provincial legislature debates that bill and gives a mandate to the delegation in the NCOP. And to have this done, you need a tight schedule. 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks. It goes. And this is how the system was developed and was operating until now. Now the question comes, what is going to happen if there is changes in the composition of the NCOP? The first one is, how do you, if there's a coalition at the provincial level, what is the effect of that? First is the delegation is representative of the legislature, the provincial legislature. Now, if you have an unstable, this is the moment before, there's also the right of recall, that a provincial legislature, say, if they're unhappy with the performance of one of its delegates, to say, we are dismissing you and you're out. There's no tenure, you're just a delegate. So there is uncertainty. That's why sometimes politicians regarded the NCOP as a bit of a difficult place. It's not a preferred employer because you have no tenure for 5 years. So now in a coalition government, depending on the stability, you will have to add your list, your delegation. It must be representative of the different parties. And if there's an unstable coalition, you can in fact change your representatives in the NCOP. Now, given that there's some stability in the delegation, then the second question is, in the provincial legislature, how easy is it to get a mandate? You have got time constraints of 4 weeks. Now, if there's no policy agreement on issues, now you must start negotiating what is the policy of this coalition government's view on a bill. And we already have the example now of Jaap, you were saying Gauteng couldn't get their act together.
Northwest, yeah.
Yeah.
Northwest.
It's the Northwest. Yeah. And that was always deeply divided, very unruly province. So then, now suddenly there is no vote, and what does that do with the majority? If there is not within a period of time a sufficient, a well-formulated mandate, and particularly if there's a loose coalition, when you have to almost negotiate from beginnings, there's not an agreement, now suddenly you have to negotiate a mandate. So this is a difficulty. If you go to the mediation committee, if a bill is rejected by the NCOP, it's referred to this committee to negotiate a compromise. If no compromise, then you obviously can, a two-thirds vote in the National Assembly can override the NCOP's rejection. Now, interesting conundrum which I haven't thought through is if the ANC as a party doesn't get a majority in the National Assembly, but it still has the majority of delegations, of delegates in the NCOP, is there going to be a tension? And the one place they are fully in the majority, in the National Assembly they're not fully in the majority, and it depends on coalitions and whether it can play then its role as dominant in the ANC and the NCOP to block legislation. And then also one must look at when the NCOP deals with the legislation not affecting provinces. Each of the 90 members of the 9 delegations have a vote, single vote. It cannot stop or veto legislation, it can delay it. So now suddenly your configuration of parties looks very different, and it may well be that the ANC may not have the majority of more than 45 of the delegates, but that is conjecture. But that's the possibility, and then can in fact delay legislation if it's not resolved in the mediation committee. Last point to make is the NCOP was a stepchild all these years. It's really what I call the third team, and politicians didn't like it. Because the first team is those who are going to the NA. The second team is those who go to the provincial legislatures, which is secure. This insecure job, you go now you're a politician. You don't stand for the NCOP. You have to wait for the NCOP or the provincial legislature to nominate you. And they nominate you and then they can recall you. So it's a very politically insecure job. And so the third team usually landed up there. And because they never disagreed with the big brother in the National Assembly, not much action is there. If, depending now obviously on the outcome of the election, some power, I predict, will shift to the NCOP. And then it will be important for political parties to put some leaders there, people of significant clout and ability, so that they can play the role that the NCOP was thought of or was envisaged to play, that they can do so adequately. Right. Yeah, what am I doing?
5 minutes.
Okay, good. Then on Executive IGR, the President's Coordinating Council is the President, a few national ministers, the 9 premiers, and SARChl's Chair. As Jaap already mentioned, who is the Premier? Do we have a Premier that looks like the current Mayor of Johannesburg, with only him representing his own party? Is that, it can look very differently if there's coalition governments, and whatever they throw up at provincial level, is these the guys that can actually negotiate. And 2, is there policy agreements in coalition governments about all the issues that the PCC must deal with, which is trying to get a coherence to government across the country. MINMEC is very similar. What happens coalition, depending the nature of the coalitions. Here it is now with the real sectoral issues. Who is the MEC? Usually in a coalition, the principal agreement is who does what job, who gets what job. And so you may have a minority party in a coalition becoming the MEC. And how is the policy then? Is that the MEC's prerogative, or is it now to getting a mandate out of the government, the coalition government, at provincial level? So again, making the MINMECs much more unstable, much more difficult to run, and so that will be a challenge. The district development model. Yeah, I can say nothing add to what the minister said, how she described the difficulties of running this model. And the model is aiming at improving coherence of service delivery in a district or a metro by bringing all three governments together at that point, pushed by the champion minister or deputy minister. It is voluntary, it's cooperative government, and if the Western Cape said, no thank you, we're not playing this game, this is not our policy, or in the Pretoria, a metro, there the mayor, the DA mayor said, no, our DA policy is not to play this game, staying out. Now, if you now add a number of political parties and differences, what's happening with this model? And so it's a difficult one. How can this model, which is really a planning device and bringing resources to a single spot, how can it actually function in the future and function effectively? Provincial interventions in municipalities, Jaap, you already touched on it. Municipal dysfunctionality is often caused by political instability, whether it's intra-party, as we heard, or inter-party between the party in control of a province and the party in control of a council. And then the irony is that this instability of a coalition resulting in non-delivery gives rise to intervention by the province, and if there's a political difference, it exacerbates the problems and the political contestation. So we have political differences between provinces and distressed municipalities, and these add to further tensions and often result in unsuccessful interventions. No cooperation, resorting to legal action to avoid it, and in the end, it is the people that suffer. So one will have to rethink how you do these interventions in a politically contested environment. And we've argued, the three of us, argued for the Western Cape, try to depoliticize the process. What you have to agree upon is the triggers that should lead to an intervention. And that trigger can be based on facts, on information, and that information can be garnered, obtained from independent institutions, like the Auditor General, like the National Treasury, the use of money, also pension funds, also SARChl. Every municipality must pay over the pay-as-you-earn for all their employees, and they would immediately know when a municipality is not paying. But that information is not being used because it's a apolitical source, absolutely accurate, and that could lead to your early warning system and eventually to intervention if it's not solved. In conclusion, I'm done. It's obviously coalition governments are going to affect our multi-level governance of the system of government. But I think our system of IGR and cooperative government is robust enough to ensure effective government because it was designed with this scenario in mind. And there is a political culture of cooperation reasonably developed, not always, I say, patchy, not as optimistic as you are, the one swallow of the A winning there, but also not playing game with the DDM. How do you explain that? But that the political culture of coalition government that we've seen at local government is poorly developed. The cooperation in coalition governments is poorly developed. So the test is going to be, and this is what the Minister also was saying, is whether political parties can adhere to the constitutional mandate of IGR and cooperative government. Can they embody and live out these values? Or are we going to follow the disastrous example of local government coalitions and service delivery? So the question is, and it's a sort of article of faith here, is the Constitution accepted as a set of principles and values, or simply a set of rules that can be weaponized against opponents? Is there actually a belief that yes, we believe in cooperative government, we think it's the best way to govern, or do we use the Constitution simply to get at our opponents? So that's the big question. You will answer that question by yourself and your own assessment of political culture at the moment, but it needs to be answered. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nico. I'm sure you agree that was a very comprehensive and important input, really going into the background of how intergovernmental relations works. I'm sure not many of us have done these kind of calculations of what the diversification of our politics means for the NCOP. How will the numbers work? How will the voting patterns pan out? And how important is it now, or how important may it become for us to really come to grips with the role of our second chamber of parliament, for example. I remember I made a presentation many years ago in Ethiopia. We've got a colleague from Ethiopia here talking about our system of intergovernmental relations, just describing the framework, IGR Framework Act, the Constitution, Chapter 3. And it was received with quite a bit of hostility, actually, because there were senior government representatives from the national government in Ethiopia, which at the time was strongly controlled by the EPRDF, very strong coalition of political formations, tightly in control of all spheres of government in Ethiopia. And they told me, we don't need your system. We don't need your rules on IGR and the rules on cooperative governance and your Chapter 3 and your Intergovernmental Relations Framework Act and your sort of values of avoiding disputes. We don't need all of that because we've got a very strong governing ruling party. And it made me think about, what's the value of our legal system. And maybe, history is now telling us a different story about Ethiopia, which is now really struggling deeply with ethnic and tension between and within communities and governments. And and it may be one of the reasons. There's many, many reasons that I'm not here to minimize or simplify the Ethiopian conundrum, but the absence of a system of intergovernmental relations, establishing patterns, establishing a framework may have contributed to that. And at least we have that. We have something that we can fall back on. But do we, as Nico said, do we weaponize it? Do we see it as just a set of rules that we can abuse or weaponize? Or do we actually see it as the values on which our constitutional order is, part of the values on which our constitutional order is based, of cooperation with the aim of service delivery? And this is my sort of segue to the next input before we can take a quick break or have our Q&A. We've spoken a lot about frameworks, about policies, about DDM, about interventions and mandates and political delegations, as if all of that sort of happens in some sort of stratosphere of governance. But in the end, it is about service delivery, the voters, the public communities, what to make of all of this from a voter's perspective, because voters, we will have to go to the polls on 29th of May. And there is that what I call the eye of the storm, where the voter in the voting booth must make a choice. What does he or she make of all of this in terms of how to make a decision on whom to vote for and how to assess what's going on in the country and what that means for our politics? And for that, I'm going to welcome Ms. Tessa Dooms to give an input. She is a director at the Rivonia Circle, which is a political think tank that I'm sure many of you are aware of. She's a sociologist, development practitioner, and political analyst. Was an academic, started her career in academia, has also been a member of the National Planning Commission, and quite often provides analysis on public media. And whenever Ms. Dooms is on TV, I always put the TV a bit louder because I want to hear what she has to say, because she always speaks so much sense. So over to you, Tessa.
I tried to creep up on Jaap to make sure that introduction was as short as possible. The less that's known about me, the better. Thank you, everyone, for this morning. I think this is a very important conversation, not only because we are on the precipice of an election, but because I think that we've learned over the past 5 to 10 years, I think we've had incremental learnings that So we've had incremental learning over the last 5 to 10 years that our politics is also determined by the systems that run it, not only by the people who are in those positions. And so I think we do need to, as we try and repair and strengthen and deepen our democracy and our politics and political culture particularly, that we take a deeper look at the systems. So I've become known in troublesome ways. One of my first year lecturers is here, and he reminded me this morning I was troublesome in first year 20 years ago already. But I've been known in the last year to say that I'm not an advocate for the defense of democracy. I'm an advocate for the innovation of democracy. I think if democracy is going to survive, we are going to have difficult conversations about how do we model and mold it to fit the changing times that we find ourselves in. And so I hope that nothing is sacrosanct in the conversations that we need to have, not only as a country, but I think the global community that is finding that democracy is in crisis, especially as people who believe in democracy. I think we've left the conversations about the state of democracy to people who don't care much for democracy at all. And so we have to bravely be the ones that champion the conversation about how do we make democracies more functional, better, more responsive to our needs as citizens, people. As it relates to our particular set of circumstances, I think the first thing to say is that our Constitution always had in mind that we needed a multi-party democracy. And I think the minister points out something really important, that when we started getting to the details of that, people didn't have in mind that the ANC would not always be dominant. And so there was kind of a political interjection in our constitutional agreement where we didn't look at the finer details about what rationally makes a multi-party democracy work, and I think there was a political arrogance that said the ANC would always be at the center. And I think part of the reason why it was important for us to commit to a multi-party democracy is because our history told us that the dominance of a few over the majority was never going to be a good and sustainable idea. Yet we've politically fallen into that trap. And I'm going to use here a metaphor, I guess, that a fellow youth development practitioner uses, where he speaks about a lion being let out of the zoo, and says that similarly, apartheid was our zoo and we were the lion. And we wanted freedom from apartheid and freedom from the zoo. But often what happens in our minds is, like a lion might, in the first days after being released from the zoo, it returns to the zoo at feeding hours because it's expecting to be fed. And so he asks the question, what is the lion free to do? The truth is the lion is free to hunt, not free to be free. And I think we have gotten into the pattern where we are still looking for the next zookeeper rather than for the next kill. We haven't actually explored what freedom could look like in a broad sense, and so we keep looking for the next zookeeper, and I think we've, as voters, as communities, as citizens, given away way too much of our power to politicians and to the state machinery. And we need to start thinking about how do we get more of us to participate in democracy and governance. And this leads me to one of the more controversial things that's happened in the citizenry and the side of communities when it comes to our democracy and governance, which is the proliferation of micro-parties, small parties. So the IEC tells us that over 500 parties are now registered as parties in the country. In 2021, about 325 contested across the country, including about 1,000 independent candidates over and above that. And in 2024, about 115 parties have met the signature threshold to be on the national ballot. Whether that's going to remain at that mark, it depends on whether the IEC can verify all of that. But that's double where we were, even if you take 20 people or 20 parties that don't qualify. That's double where we were in 2019. And then there's 16 independent candidates across the country that will be contesting. Why have we ended up here in a country that's getting fewer and fewer people who are voting? Because our voting numbers have declined. The minister's right, we have so few people who are even registering to vote that in the 2021 election, only a third of people who were over the age of 18 actually showed up. So we have fewer and fewer people voting, but we have more and more parties. What explains that? To our minds at the Rivonia Circle, what explains it is people want a system where they feel more represented. And they feel like they have more of a relationship with those who represent them. And so when I look at the plurality of parties or call for independent candidates, I'm not thinking about it in terms of the people who are starting the parties. I'm thinking about it in terms of the people who are willing to sign to say this party should exist, because each of those need 1,000 signatures minimum to just register as a party. In order to get onto the ballot, you needed 15,000 signatures as a party minimum to get onto just the national ballot, and up to 62,000 if you wanted to be on all of the ballots. There are parties that have gotten in excess of 100,000 votes as a new party, not votes, signatures as new parties. There is a sense that our electorate wants something else, wants something different. And I don't think the different thing is I'm so desperate for this guy to be the guy or this person to be the person. In fact, what you're seeing is people don't even care that the person that they vote for may not be president. They care that that person might have a seat at the table, and they might have access to the person who has a seat at the table. And I think that's important because our electorate is left out. So we talk about cooperative governance. And when we say that, we're actually only talking about the government itself. Our cooperative governance does not include the citizen. does not include the community, does not include the voter. It barely includes formalized NGOs. It barely includes business. It barely includes anything that's not an actual government structure. And I think that there's a pulse in the country that's saying the people feel left behind the democracy. I am haunted by the words of a young man from Mlazi who said to us 2 years ago, the reason why young people don't vote is because we get the vote, but they get the democracy. We get the vote, but somebody else gets democracy. We don't get to govern ourselves. Most people don't even feel they get to govern their households at this point. And so we have to think about this question about cooperative governance, this question about how we get a democracy that functions beyond just the arms of the state itself. We must read into the current political temperature that people want more access to power. So how does this fit into the question, particularly about what cooperative governance means at a technical level? So we have the 3 spheres of government and the 3 layers, as it were. I mean, the citizenry, if we just speak about the judiciary, parliament, and the executive, the citizenry has no say in who the executive is. In our governance and our electoral system, we have no say on who the executive is. That's the reason why we could have 2 presidents recalled without anyone even blinking at the electorate, right? We don't directly elect those people. So our relationship to the executive, who we fixate on, by the way, we fixate on the president, but we don't elect the president. Parliament elects the president. We can't recall the president. Parliament recalls the president. But we fixate on that level, even though we have no real relationship to that level. The judiciary, we should have access to, but we do know that the cost is prohibitive. The ability to mobilize just even the technical aspects of using the judiciary as us, as the voters, is actually very difficult. It's difficult for voters to just approach the courts. It's easy to say approach the courts, but really it takes a lot to approach the courts. So there's a difficulty there. And then Parliament has become a difficulty as well, even though we do elect those people. Because the ways in which, again, our electoral system centers parties, because we vote for parties, not individuals, means that those individuals who end up in those chairs belong to the party, not the individual. And so the people who take up those seats are worried about what the party thinks of them, not what the voter thinks of them, right? So at the level of spheres of government, we've kept out voices that are not political in a party political sense. And I think there's a detriment that we are feeling when it comes to that. But in terms of the levels of government, this is probably a little bit more worrying. Because at local government level, we do have more direct access to our representatives. But our political culture has told us not to use that direct access. So we directly have ward councillors that we elect, but we pretend that those seats belong to the party. So in the city of Joburg, where we've seen all of this back and forth and votes that have happened, so many votes have happened in that council. The ANC has 91, I think, seats, or 91 representatives, let's not call them seats. Only 4 of those are actually PR seats. The rest of them are actually ward councillors, directly elected. That's why we're seeing so many by-elections, because by-elections are about the ward councillor seat, because the party can't just replace those people at will. The seat doesn't belong to the party. Yet again, as voters and as communities, we're doing very little to use that as a pressure point, to use the fact that a ward councillor is directly elected and the seat doesn't belong to the party. And how do we then mobilize and galvanize people around putting pressure on ward councillors as individuals, not just as party hands and party hacks? We're underutilizing the powers we do have. But I remember a few years ago, 2021, when we were talking about voter education around this, where people asked us, well, why can't we recall the ward councillors? Why can't we do anything? So people, at this point, if you're upset with your ward councillor, you're more likely to burn down their house than to approach council because you know the council's not going to listen to you. And so the pressure points need also to be re-looked at so that you have more voter participation in being able to put pressure on people to deliver for us. So at the local level, we should have more access, but don't, right? What's even more important at the local level is that because of the way our system is structured, local government's money has to actually come from the local people, the direct tax from the people. As the most unequal country in the world, that poses a real threat. So we can't be surprised when certain people can get better services than others, when certain people have more jobs than others, more income than others, more ability to pay tax than others, more functional municipalities that are collecting the tax than others. Now, this is supplemented by the grant, but is the grant a sufficient tool? Is the national government grant that is given a sufficient tool to actually look at those imbalances and correct for them? And is that a sustainable way, on a user-pay principle, on the basis that people with more resources are likely to get more services, at a basis where we're treating people and communities as if they're customers rather than citizens? Is that sustainable? I would think not. And I think the minister points out really importantly that everything happens at that level regardless of where it originates from. Because national's role is policy and coordination, not delivery. It's policy and coordination, not delivery. And so you could have the best policies and the best coordination and still no delivery unless you fix what happens at municipal level. Because ultimately that's where the rubber hits the road. One of the propositions I think we need to think about carefully going into the future is why are our best people not deployed at local government level? Why is the person with the master's and the PhD aiming for the national job rather than the local one? Why are the bureaucrats that we're hiring? Here, they can have just a diploma. There, they must have a master's. I think we need to start inverting where we put our best capabilities. Less of a focus on national, more of a focus on local. Because ultimately, what we've done in terms of creating what I call a false hierarchy. So we speak about the fact that a province can put a municipality or metro under administration, or national can put under administration. That creates a false hierarchy. Because ultimately, national should not have to, province should not have to take over municipalities. You need municipalities to be strong enough to govern themselves. And if they're not strong enough to govern themselves, even if national puts it under administration, there's very little national has in terms of the capacity for delivery. And so we can't rely on that stick. We need to cultivate it so that you have the strongest possible people at the municipal level as opposed to sitting at national waiting for something to go wrong at municipal. It makes no sense. Now, you'll notice that I've left province for last. And that's really because I'm just not sure why it's there. I genuinely am not sure anymore. So province is sitting in this weird position where it's half policy, half coordination, half delivery, delivery on some things, delivery not on others. It's a proliferation. Everybody's doing their own thing. I have no idea what we're doing with provinces, guys. And I think the DDM model and the need for it makes the case by itself. That actually what we need a lot more of is more localized levels of engagement than this meta level where the province is doing stuff and now it has to figure out who it's reporting to, who it's giving instructions to, who it's taking instructions from. It's a long overdue conversation. Why do we have them? Why do we have them in that form? What are their real powers? Who do they really report to? I'm at a loss. However, what all of this represents for me is a fundamental issue that we have. And I'm going to really try and wrap up very quickly. But I think we have too many politicians. I think part of the reason why we're struggling with cooperative governance is not just too many parties. Because parties, the electorate can help you sift out parties. The truth is, even in a single majority municipality, government, we just have too many politicians. A country like the US that has 300 million people has, what, less than 15 departments, national departments? We've got 30. What are we doing with so many politicians? We are proliferating politicians and then struggling to coordinate them. Part of the reason why I think an advocacy around not having that layer of provinces is that fewer structures, by virtue of being fewer, will help with coordination. Fewer politicians will help with coordination. Fewer people in the room will help. And then there's also just fewer people to go and hold accountable. We know where to go. At this point, if you wanted to know how to solve or to report on an issue you're having with electricity, you have 3 ministers to choose from. You must hedge your bets on who you think might be able to solve your problem today. I think we have too many politicians, but too few opportunities for voters to engage them. And so I think we have to really think about how many departments we have, how many structures we have. This is not counting the extra entities, things like the NYDA, DBSA. Guys, we have too many politicians, too many structures, too many entities. And again, the DDM tells us we actually need fewer, not more. And I know that all of us are advocating for our single issue. So we want a Department of Land that is separated from the Department of Rural Development because it must get its own. No, that's going to make it worse, not better. We have 2 departments of education. And then we wonder why young people are falling out between the cracks and not getting into vocational training. So that's the second last provocation that I'll make. And I want to go back to the minister's point about Bibles. I do think that we must look at what our Bible is, right? We had the National Development Plan, and I say had because at this point I don't know that it still exists, if we're honest with ourselves. But we do need a Bible, and the Constitution isn't a Bible, right? Because the Constitution doesn't give us the playbook for how. It just tells us what. The MTSF, which none of us as citizens are familiar with, is a million different things, right? So it's hard for us to grasp. The IDPs don't get taken seriously, and we have no way to actually make sure they're enforced. So we do need to get serious about a Bible of governance. And that Bible of governance must be sitting in the hands of not a professionalized public service, but a depoliticized public service. Because even in our bureaucracy, we've got politicians. At a conference that Jaap and I were at 2 weeks ago, somebody made an example about how the guy who's driving the van is actually the chairperson of the provincial branch of an ANC, and then goes to the MMC to say, actually, I'm your political principal. So you should be listening to me when I say that there's a memo on your desk. Our public service is not professional enough. It's too political. There are too many actors that are acting on the basis of political whims. And in other parts of the world, people are trying to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? Why is it important, especially now that we have this era of coalitions? It is absolutely important because while the politicians play politics, somebody needs to hold the center. Our edifice, our democratic edifice, our governance edifice must be at the center, held by people who can't change their jobs at will, can't be removed by some political fight that's got nothing to do with us. And so if we depoliticize the administration, That means we don't need to hurry for 2 weeks, for 14 days, to get MMCs and a mayor in place, otherwise all will fall apart. We can take our cue from other places in the world where they can go up to a year without having the politicians in place because the bureaucracy functions, so my water is not at risk every time an MMC can't make a decision. We must stop being held hostage by politicians. We must also have much better sense that our politicians can be held accountable by us. And so when we think about the role of all spheres of government going into this election particularly, I want us as voters to not focus on who's going to be president, but who's going to be in parliament. Parliament's role is oversight over the people who need to make decisions and deliver. We are going to not hire or fire a president on the 29th of May. We are going to hire and fire members of parliament and members of provincial legislations. By a show of hands, how many of us in this room, except for the president, well, the president has actually linked out this way, so except for ministers and leaders of parties, how many of you can name, without Googling, 10 other MPs? One. I can't raise my hand for that. Because I can't. Because we're not actually paying attention to who those people are. Political parties don't give us the information. We don't spend the time of going to the parliamentary website and learning who those people are. We don't engage them. And it's because we don't think that they report to us. And there's a political culture that says that they won't respond to us. And so I think we must focus on MPs at this point. We must change the way we think. And we must ask political parties before we go to the election, show us your MP list. Help us understand why these people are there and tell us how they are going to account to us. We are voting in MPs on the 29th. They will vote for president, but we are voting for them. We should know who we are voting for. And so my parting shot is that if the people shall govern is going to have any bearing in our society, we need to ask how often, in which ways, and what mechanisms are in place for people to get more and more involved in democratic practices at all spheres of government and all levels of government. We must be looking for that. And so again, as we look at political party manifestos, the question isn't just the issues that everyone needs to solve. It's the mechanisms through which they are going to solve them. And one of those mechanisms must include more accountability, more participation, and less that we are giving our power to somebody in hope that in 5 years' time they may come back to us or not. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Tessa. That was some really important, fascinating provocations. I really like the example of the lion returning to the zoo, because that's where he expects to be fed. And as you were talking about, bringing us back to the core issue of we're electing parliamentarians, we're electing a parliament, we're electing provincial legislatures, we're not electing a president or premiers. Linking it back to the issue of intergovernmental relations, that intergovernmental relations happens in that context and depends on quality leadership. The quality and the caliber of the leadership that we elect into these structures, National Assembly, provincial legislatures, they will be the ones that ultimately determine how also the system of intergovernmental relations will function and will it function properly. As you were talking about we need to invert it, put the best people at local government level. For my sins, I once did a small study on career patterns of politicians. And indeed, we don't do that. I was reminded of this quote of former mayor of New York, De La Guardia. They named the airport after him. They said, who wants to be president when you can be mayor of New York? It's actually simple. That's where the real issues are, that's where the real power is. We don't think like that. We have this sort of, and I was speaking about it with the minister this morning, we have this sort of natural, instinctive idea that the most corrupt and incapable people at local government level, at provincial level it's slightly better, people are less corrupt and slightly smarter, but the least corrupt and smartest people are at national government level. Somehow we think like that. And it's based on absolutely nothing but an intuitive sort of affinity with hierarchy. And I think you penetrated that. So thanks very much for that input. The last 25, 30 minutes we will use for a bit of a Q&A engagement. We've got more than 60 people online, so it will be very important to also get their inputs and their questions. So let's see if we can use the last 30 minutes effectively. We've got Johandri, Dr. Wright there managing the chat. So people that are joining us online, please be part of this conversation. We really value you being with us and part of the audience. You can put your questions in the chat box, and then Dr. Wright will communicate them to us. So as those hopefully start flowing in, let me just first put out the call to our audience. Any questions or inputs that you would want to make? And maybe you can start off by just briefly saying who you are, where you're from, and keep your questions short and to the point so that we can get as many as possible.
Good morning. I'm Damaris Kiewicz and I'm in the Community Engagement Unit at this university. And the last speaker has actually touched on a point where I think possibly that's where a lot of citizens are at the moment. Some don't even know who their local councillor is. And the sad part of our democracy is the inability of the government to fund voter education. Not even universities are prepared to look at citizen engagement through voter education. If you look at the list of the top 10 parties for MPs, it's people that don't even have a clue of what's really happening in communities. So for me, the question is, and it's 30 years down the line, die Here help ons. Our citizens are not even interested in what happens to our tax monies. There's portfolio sittings. There's engagement around the annual performance plan. We have a say. We have a say, we don't pitch. There's a sitting around the annual review. We have a say. We don't pitch. I pitch because health is a critical component for me. I irritate them. So when I walk into the room, I don't walk alone. I walk with my tribe. Just yesterday, the Department of Health in this province had a budget, community budget expo. We took them down because they came to lie to people. We that know cannot allow. We can't be almost like accomplished crookeds that says, no, they're coming to talk to our people. If I know better, I need to do better. And as citizens, we, on the 29th of May, and post the 29th of May, we need to do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there was a gentleman next. Here we go. Over to you, sir.
Good day. My name is Sanil Ndike. I'm a master's student at the School of Governance at this university. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone that came here. I'm going to try and keep it short. I want to mainly focus on the point that the Minister has mentioned today about the issue of service delivery being at the forefront of the intergovernmental relations. I'm very much of the view that you presented today, Minister, of the one that the government, I think, should intervene in terms of how to regulate the coalition of the government. Because, I mean, like, if we are all of here sitting today and everyone is saying that there's a bus that we need to drive, and all of us have a Code 14 license to drive this bus, particularly one question I would ask is that, does it matter who drives the bus, or what matters most is that the bus gets to the destination? So I think now that's the most important thing out of all of this, that whoever governs, are they going to be able to put South Africa in the place that everyone in the country needs to be? And the other thing that I wanted to ask in particular now, Minister, to focus on the regulation of the coalition, is how would now the government, if they're trying to regulate, you mentioned that you're going to release a bill soon by COGTA suggesting on how we're going to regulate the coalition. How is the government now going to be like ensuring the integrity of the democracy is being kept, and then the sovereignty of the different spheres of government, like the local government, the provincial government, and the national government, is being kept? Because now you might say that the national government at the helm of everything is going to try and make sure that development takes place in all places. But now how does now the role of other different spheres of government come into act in this play? Thank you.
Thank you. Have you got more hands? I see. Maybe Shireen there? Yeah? Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaap, for giving me the opportunity. And thank you to all the panelists for the very exciting inputs. I'm Shireen, I'm a recovering civil servant, proud to say. I spent almost 2 decades in government, since 1999. So if you go back 1999, when we entered municipalities, that was still NP ruled. And this new constitution and changes and new system of local governance was not a thing. In fact, it wasn't welcome. So I'm a recovering civil servant, and I wanted to, I'm so blind, mention one example that I ran into with IGR, working in the province, when we had a big conflict with the water board. And the municipalities approached us and said, well, the water board is double taxing us, we are convinced of it, and there's nothing we can do about it. And when they approached the province, all of the people who were meant to be part of the process of resolving the conflict stepped out of the water. National Treasury, COGTA, everyone was too scared to get involved. And it wasn't because the people weren't there, the systems were there. Sometimes it's simply confidence in the competence to analyze certain things. And it took us 2 years to get a legal opinion, to put pressure on it, for some solutions to come through. In the meantime, the board was dissolved. The executive ran away because when people started looking at the finances, there were dodgy things going on and there were double taxation happening. And they had to let go of the tax, and we all know how it works with the fiscal system. If you want a new tax in local government, you don't just get it. You engage cooperatively, and the framework is there with Treasury. So that's one of the things that happened. And it is still happening. A lot of these issues remains unresolved. In terms of the IDP and the DDM, I had to do this work in practice. It's almost an impossibility. And for a very long time, while I was doing oversight in the province, my question often was, how do we anchor the IDP so that you see it in the budget? We're talking about the IDP having prominence. It doesn't even appear in the budget. So if it's not in the budget, where is it happening? So it took me a very long time to realize the IDP is the political document, the budget and the master plans is where the real things are happening. And this is how we also divided people within municipalities. It is a very interesting thing. And then when we had to do the one plan, the amount of copying and pasting that was going on, there was no chance in hell I would trust the one plan that was coming out of what we were busy doing. So that's one of the things. And for me, then the big question is, you talk about the infrastructure. It's something that's been very fascinating for me. I did the CEF for Stellenbosch municipality. And I can tell you we struggled. It's a very technical thing if you really want to make it work. And if we're talking about cities not having their BEPS ready yet, cities have been working on built environment plans for more than a decade. And now we're entering capital expenditure frameworks for bigger local authorities like Stellenbosch, and we're still not getting it right. But somewhere along the line, those plans, the long-term financial plans, your IDPs, and your one plan for the DDM, needs to meet each other some way. And we have so much legislation in Europe, you see so much of it happening almost automatically. It's like there's a vested interest and we pull together and we make it happen. But here we want to politicize it first and then we decide who gets to drive what, which is why all of our best people are working elsewhere where the money is and where they're not being frustrated to deliver on exactly what they're being asked to deliver. So for me, that is one of the big things. The DDM, nobody takes it seriously. It should be taken seriously, because if we don't get our regional planning right, we are just regressing further from our current point of status quo. So those are some of the things I just wanted to share with you. And then thank you very much for sharing the democracy, because democracy is not from one election to another. It's something I often ask politicians, because politicians don't like to account. They make the bureaucrats account, and then the politicians run away with promises that are never delivered. So what happens with that is, for me, the big question is, how do we manage this thing that happens between elections? And we have a very established system of citizen engagement within the system, Minister. It's very costly, it's very cumbersome, and it delivers very little for us, and the politicians do not take it seriously. So for me, that is something we really have to look at. Why are we so busy being busy, achieving so little? And that is another thing we have to do. In terms of the intergovernmental grant framework, thank you for raising that. I've not looked at it like that before. It was a very, very important input. When you look compared to other countries, we have a wonderful system. And I sell it proudly everywhere, right? But there is an unbalanced expectation for local government to run itself. So what I often tell people, what makes me proud about our system of local governance, we collect our own money, which means we have more autonomy, more freedom to choose what happens with that money. The more grants we get, every grant has so many conditions, it's not local money. And our block grant is too small. So if you look at the Netherlands, The Hague has the budget the size of our country, same as New York City. But they would still get up to 52, between 45% and 52% grants from the national coffers. But they all collect together. And I think there are certain things we can reconsider. On that note, I think I've had a whole session.
Thank you. Let me just get an inventory of hands. Just take one more question on that side. I see your hand, sir. We're coming to you. And I see you. Johandri, I've got you. And who else? I could just get and then Jenica. And I see that one. So let's take one more question, and we go to the panel, and then we take the further questions. So I've got all of you. Over to you.
Thank you. Good day. My name is Beverly Make. I am doing my master's with the Dullah Omar Institute. My question is to Mr. Nkadimeng. My question is based on intergovernmental relation, to the extent of the interventions that you may have. In accordance to the judicial fact, you as the Minister of Corporate Governance, you do have, to some extent, powers in terms of interventions where local governments may not be performing their duties to the full extent. And the example that you made with the situation in Philippi and how residents lost their homes, my question is, since your appointment as the Minister of Corporate Governance and the term that you have had, what are the mandates, what are the plans, the structures that you have put in place in making sure that when situations like this arises, local government are able to perform to their full extent? You did say that you may make that report to the local governance, but they may not answer to you. in that extent, you do, in some extent, have judicial effect where you can intervene in when those mandates are not fulfilled. What have you done? What have you put in place to address such issues?
Great.
Thank you.
Politicians are here to account. That's great, fantastic. I'm going to take one more question, but I'm taking on that side, not because I don't see you, but just so that we don't have to travel too much with the microphone. Maybe the lady in black, will you ask your question, and then we're going to go to the panel.
Yeah. Good. I'm not sure if it's morning or afternoon right now. My name is Patwan Musobi, and I'm also doing my master's in the University of the Western Cape. I don't know if my question is going to be of relevance, but I'd like to just pick your brain and get people's opinion on this. And this is to any panelist, but I mostly resonate with the last speaker. I agree with majority of the things that she said. Whew. So my question is, do you think we will ever have a successful government without rethinking the structures of government? Because if we are being honest, in 1996, when the Constitution was enacted, there was really no systematic changes that took place. So do we really think we will be able to have a successful government that works for the people without rethinking those structures, but by simply enacting laws on failing systems? Because what we're doing is we are still being kept hostage by our history, and we think that we're moving forward, but our government doesn't work for the people. So what's you guys' take on that? Thank you.
Great stuff. Let's now return to the panel. We've got questions waiting in the wings. I'll come to you, and Johandri, we're going to the online questions as well. But let's first get a sense from the panel on what their observations are in response. Maybe we'll just use the same order as the lineup that we had. So, Tinashe, if you want to start, I can give the microphone to you.
All right, thank you very much. I think I would just respond on two issues. The first one is, I think, something that we discussed in the previous seminar, where we were saying that we need to build a bureaucracy that works, whether there's political turmoil or not, especially at the local government level. Because the biggest challenge that is there at the present moment is that once there is a coalition disagreement or political tussle in the council, then service delivery stops. So myself and Prof. Jaap, we had this provoking idea that how can we ensure that the MM and other senior managers are able to take decisions on service delivery, because you can't wait for councillors, for situation to stabilize in the council for service delivery to continue. And we are not saying, if you look at in Europe, for example, you can have governments, coalition governments formed over several months, but you won't see any differences on the ground because service delivery will be kicking. So how do we ensure that in the South African context, service delivery continues in cases of political turmoil? Then my last input is on the issue of citizens not utilizing spaces that is there. So the issue is that we can see that citizens prefer to create their own space to vent their frustration. So they don't use your ward, participation structures, your usual participation structures in terms of, for example, when you put out a bill, your submissions, they don't use those spaces that have been created. And the question that we need to ask is, why is it they are no longer using those structures? Why are they inviting their own spaces to vent their frustrations? I think Shireen, answered that question well. If you can make a submission in terms of the IDP to say, these are our aspirations, these are our interests, these are the things that we want our communities to, that must be addressed over a 5-year term, and the budget doesn't speak to that, doesn't speak to the IDP, what motivation do you have to continue to use the IDP process as a means to communicate your interests in local government? So this is, for me, I think, a critical issue that needs urgent attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you for questions. Yeah, it does, Prof, like I've come to account. But it is good. We must account at every space. Maybe let me start on the very first point of not utilizing the platforms that are being given. And basically on all spheres. But maybe let's stick to the local government sphere. Council, by their very own nature, are open community meetings. I've been a mayor for 8 years. I've never seen a committee attend. I'm recorded in the area I was running. It almost had close to 1 million people. I'll do on every quarter. Of course, it has traditional communal communities. It's not 100% urban. The rural community will attend more than the urban. And the rural community will still keep even their own traditional structures and invite the mayor outside the tent of IDP and whatever and ask you, can you give us a report on that road and why not that road and why not? Maybe we must also look into what causes this distinction. Yet there was no collection, there still is no collection in the 70% of that seat in the rural edge because they are covered in the equitable share and only collection happens in the 30%, which is the rural, the urban, which is the town and the townships. Portfolio committees, by their very own nature, at a local level, could even be extended to be public. In some instances, if it's not public, the public is allowed to make a request. I've never seen one. In fact, we may study out of interest, the Rustenburg municipality. It used to do its appointments in public. So they will do the interview like we're seated here, and there are people. It will invite the community. There will be legal attendance to choose their own municipal manager. So there's various models. I know in Gauteng, MEC Lebogang Maile, while he was still in Kokta, had applied to National Treasury to even do the tendering system openly at local government. And National Treasury was very skeptical on the safety and whatever of documentation, but there have been practical instances where the community gets to be invited and brought into the systems of what they are intended to participate. Maybe the issue is, what is it that is not being done? But I'm thinking from experience as well and what the legislation says, it allows you, if it allows you to get into a council, it then allows you to see if this IDP this budget is aligned to the IDP. In fact, at local government, it even forces a mayor and its council to publicize its tenders on a quarter basis. To say, I've given you 1 million, you have given 10 rand to Nkadimeng to do this road, whatever. You must come and listen to that in council and question it. So I'm yet to see a system, really. You can rethink, but I'm yet to see a system. If it's as open as it is, maybe the question should be, why are we not in the room? Honestly, critique what Tessa is raising. Why are we not in the room? I don't think it's a system rethink, it's a community rethink. But let's get to think about it openly. Why is it even when we are not serviced properly at a Pick and Pay, we don't complain? I'm thinking, you go into a queue, there's a long queue. In fact, I have a friend who always makes a joke and says, you know, my friend, my mom comes from Swaziland. There's one thing about South Africans. If you see them queuing, they are going to leave their money. They're not going to collect money in a government queue. Because if you want a token for Eskom, you get a long queue. You queue for it, you pay. And she says to me, I've never seen such a thing. People who just queue innocently, you'd even think the way they are so patiently queuing, they're going to receive something. They are likely to be going to pay and purchase. But it's the system, maybe in the culture of who we are and how we're doing things, we are not strong enough in raising what is a discomfort. We may also want to look into that. But you've seen it happening. If you get to a hospital, well, my officials know, my drivers know I'm one person who violates the rules so much openly. So I drive myself. I go to, if I'm taking my mom to hospital, I go myself. And I ask the nurse, why are you sitting at the tea room when there are people outside? And says, who are you? I'm like, it's not important. Why are you sitting here when there are grannies outside? And the answers I get are very, very interesting. And ultimately, if it becomes difficult, I'm Minister Nkadimeng, I'm going to call your minister now that you are sitting here and there are people there. And when I ask everybody who's sitting there, but why didn't you just come and say, sister, can you service us? No, they won't service you. They will have attitude. Others even beg you, can you please report so and so, but please don't say it's me, because I'm going to be victimized. I said, okay, I'll do it, but I won't raise it if it's you. And some of you will say it's easy for me to do it because I'm a minister, but I don't think so. That is why I don't need bodyguards to do it. Even in case at any Tegwini I was walking myself, I got lost for him. I don't know how he found me. But in the space where there is huge tension, we don't do that. Sanele, you will see, I spoke about a coalition framework. In estimation, between now and government printers, in about 14 days or less, it will be out for public participation. We are detailing what we are trying to regulate there. Does it matter who drives the bus? It does. But remember, the bus must have a destination first. Otherwise, if we get to a bus now and get a capable driver, and the driver doesn't know where he or she is going, we are all doomed. And that's in my view, using the scenario for example. And my Bible talks to a defined destination for all of us to then get into your bus, Sanel, and give it to you as a capable master's student, and you take us to our destination. In some instances, Minister Mtsoaledi puts it very well. We come from the same province, and I used to like how we will explain and express out of frustration how development happens in South Africa, particularly mostly in the settlements. People settle, plan, and then develop. What is the correct line? You plan, you develop, and then you settle people. But what normally happens in municipalities, rightly or wrongly, and these are social ills that today we may not have a chance to talk about. They settle. You then try find a way of planning around them. In some instances, you can't even create a straight road. You find a person living under a line of electricity or power, and there's not even the creation surcharge of land that is supposed by law to be there, because the person has already built there, and sometimes in areas where you call them wetlands. And the argument will be, maybe the municipality is not ready, the municipality didn't entertain them, some will talk about migration, whatever all those complexities, the issue is the order is never correct. And that's what we need to fix and correct. I still believe in the sovereignty of all the spheres, and I think I mentioned it. That the spheres, yes, they are interdependent, but we must always guard against a sphere that feels is dominant than the other sphere. But in section 139, which I'm releasing as well at the same time, I took 3 bills to Parliament, to Cabinet, just yesterday. 3 from COCTA. One is general amendment laws, the other one looks at section 100 and 139, the other one looks at coalitions. So they possibly will be released at the same time for public participation. But what do you say? Let me take an example where National was intervening, where Cabinet took a decision to intervene, which is very rare. because the province intervenes with the support of the minister. But in Mangaung, we took the municipality, the metro, and we placed national directive, meaning the Minister of Transport, COGTA, Health, and everybody became responsible for all the functions and deployed administratively. From a CFO from National Treasury, everything else jointly. Council still had a decision to approve our plan or not. As national, because the law says you are a sphere, anything that needs to happen, it doesn't even give me a waiver as a minister to say, no, decide on their behalf. No, you can't. The law remains the same. We all are experts external and can get the approval of council. And now they write to the Minister of COGTA to ask for a waiver on this or that. But we're doing that on not on a legal standing. It's more on a discussion level and on cooperation. So the greatest test should be, when there is an intervention, there must be a direct decision. That is, you have failed to exercise your fiduciary responsibility. Hence, you are placed under administration. If you look the order of the Constitution, it emphasizes Section 154, then 139. It says national provincial government support a municipality. Support. Use 139 as a last measure, which is intervene. And I think that line needs to remain and be respected. But when you want to talk accountability, particularly at the local government sphere, and people think there are small cases that you will just override. It could be on extreme. And I've got quite a number of examples that one can make. In fact, a case in Free State and Northwest, there are very few functional municipalities there, if any. Free State and Northwest. Northern Cape following a bit close by, but relatively better than the two. So there are areas where government has to take course. You go to Metsimahulu municipality, for example, in the Free State. You allocate them a budget as per their IDP, and they put a sports complex, a complex of 21 million. It gets approved. 21 million gets to be spent, but there's no sports complex. And those people are under administration. So the first question, logically, out of anger, you will say to me, hey, these people were under administration. Where is the 21 million? Maybe you're correct. But what does the law say? The law says oversee the approval of the budget, puts the systems in place, adhere to ensuring that the MM and council spend the money and account appropriately. So we're trying now under administration, not on law provision that we say the AG must do real-time audit. In each and every month, you must incur that cost, including the disaster fund fees. But it's not necessarily on the law. It's what a minister could be allowed to do on provision of setting up a regulation and try and force them to do that. Maybe let me not touch on other areas, but colleagues could do that. But Shireen touched me when she spoke about it and she disappeared. When she touched about the water board, DDM, and the IDP not in the budget, I think I differ. I differ on a matter practically. And having been a president of SARChl gives me a bit of a bigger view with regard to municipalities generally in the country. What informs the budget of municipalities is the IDP. It may not be to the latter. COGTA actually has a unit, national, that reviews the IDP with the budget. Yes, grants comes with their conditions. A IDP and a budget that is not 80% aligned does not get approved. I can be held accountable. Just name one. Bring the IDP, let me bring the budget. 80% they are aligned.
the problem we have, Mama, is what we have spotted correctly. Is us saying, what have you done with the budget that has been given to you, or the quality of what you have raised as a community that I want that road tarred. And it gets tarred maybe not to the quality of what it's supposed to be. So it's more of an accountability from the citizens taking their rightful space, and me in government taking my rightful space in delivering quality appropriately, timeously, effectively, and efficiently as the system should be. We may want to look into all that, but I don't think they are misaligned to beyond that. A budget is just an instrument. Even National Treasury on Section 71 reports start by alignment of the IDP into the budget and then releases in chunks. And that is done religiously. But we miss the loop of accountability, we miss the loop of quality, and we miss the loop of citizens' responsibility in ensuring that we hold our councillors and any government, including politicians, accountable. Thanks, Prof.
Thanks. Very quickly, just a comment on can we have a successful country without rethinking the structures? I think it's an important question. And there's a lot of talk about, rethinking this constitution. But it works from a premise that the Constitution is now standing in the way of being successful. And first you have to define what we understand under success. One critical principle in the Constitution itself is the notion of equality, is that we have a country of more equality rather than less equality, as it seems the trend is. And then have to identify what are the provisions or the structures in this constitution that stand in the way of achieving that. One obvious one has been access to land and the distribution of land, which is something I think before Cabinet right now on the expropriation. But then we think, what are the structures that really stand in? Is the way that we have courts being able to pronounce on the Constitution, enforcing human rights. Is it the structure of not electing a president directly, but via parliament? And so one has to really start unpacking what we have problems with this, because in the end, this constitution talks about limited government, government accountable to the people, and the courts being able to enforce it. And are we now rethinking that? Some people say, well, let's go back to parliamentary sovereignty. Parliamentary is supreme, it can do anything it likes, with disregard any rights preserved in the Constitution or mentioned here. Are we there or not? So it is an important question. We can't assume that this is the Bible. It's been written by Mother and Father in 1996. Of course, it's a dynamic document, but what are our problems with it? Usually you say a document is not in itself living. Is it how it's implemented? Is it there structurally a problem that we have with it? Thanks.
So, yeah, so many small points that are bouncing around, but I wanted to focus in on just three. One is the question about NGOs, community-based structures, that civic education bit, and civic participation bit. I do think we are underfunded and we don't resource civics, right? So at a basic education level or at education level generally, somebody was speaking about even at the universities, we're not funding it. So we don't fund democratic engagement, and we fund on an issue-by-issue basis. But we've also allowed that space to be driven by funders, right? And so the state needs to also re-look at its NGO funding. a depoliticized state needs to also look at a depoliticized NGO funding system. Don't think we're looking at that enough, but a focus on things like democracy and governance within how the state resources NGOs to do that work, I think is important. The state resources itself to do that work is important. But ultimately, the significance of that is how then it gets utilized. So in Khayelitsha, there's been a move since COVID and the cans that developed there, that one of the wards in Khayelitsha started doing work around budgets. And they would look at budget line items and then question whether that spending has happened. They got to the point in 2021 where they decided that they were going to lobby for getting their own councillor elected from the community as an independent, and then start to do education in that community around how we're going to make accountability real, even with the person we get elected. So they did get somebody elected from that community, and now follow the councillor, not only through the ward committee, but through segments of that community to council meetings on the basis of what needs to be delivered, what the councillors agreed to go and take forward on their behalf. And so I only say that to say that the civics needs to be there and the education needs to be there, and then you need the operationalization of that as advocacy tools. And what we can't do when it comes to that is just wait on NGOs to be the ones that operationalize that. You need the culture within communities to be able to be strong enough to do that. And so I think there's a political culture issue that needs to change amongst how we So that's the first thing. The second, though, is that there's culture changes that are needed from outside as the citizenry, but there's also culture changes that are needed from the side of particularly political parties. So Pearl Pillay, one of people who works in the youth sector, asks the question, what is the role of a political party in between elections? And I think that part of the role of political parties in between elections is to be political advocates and champions, whether in government or outside of government, for communities. And I don't think that that's the relationship that exists at the moment. There is a relationship that's very transactional between communities and politicians, where the politician only engages the community when there's a vote at stake. And so you have to change that, and that means the kind of drivers we have matters. The kind of politicians we have matters. The way in which we think of what a political party is and does matters. Before 1994, political parties and entities were not trying to get voted in, yet they were engaging. They were there, they were present, and they weren't NGOs. They were political entities, doing political education, doing political activation, doing political mobilization. Now, they've decided that they're only there for votes. It's nonsense. We need different kinds of politics and different kinds of relationships to politicians. And so politicians can't get away with only being incentivized through votes. There must be new incentives for political engagement beyond just a vote. And I think that's a broader question about what we expect from political parties. We can't just expect that they're going to take up a seat. We must expect more from them, demand more from them. On the other side of that, you have to think about what is the political consequence. And this is where I disagree with the minister to the extent that the systems can be there for participation, but if there's no consequence for the politician, why should they listen? And that's the reason, part of the reason why as citizens we don't show up. Because we feel like we're going to show up so that the politician can tick the box that we were there, but there's no mechanism for us to make sure that the accountability happens. And that's a system error. The fact that recall is not in the hands of the voter is a system issue. The fact that you don't have direct access to an MP in the way that the MP feels responsive to you is a systems issue. So we can get the cultures right, but if we don't have the systems that follow the culture, I think that that's where we're going to fall short. And then the last point, I promise you, I can see you looking at me from the corner of your eye. the point that you raised, at the Rivonia Circle, we say South Africa is due for an upgrade. And I think that we must get more engaged in the question about what the destination is in technical and practical terms. And there must be cultures of revisiting that from time to time. So we talk too abstractly about what it is that we want as a future. And I think we must start to pin down, in the next 5 years, at a practical level, how must South Africa look different than what it looks today? In 10 years' time, practically, how must it look different from what it looks today? The Constitution doesn't help us with that. It only provides the playing field. It tells us which game we're playing. It doesn't tell us how many goals we must score. And as citizens, again, we have to get more involved in that work. We have to demand that. So we're going into election, and as citizens, we don't know what we want. We're waiting for politicians to tell us what they want to do for us. We don't have demands because we're not having the conversation with each other about what it is we want, because we think that politics is for politicians. Active citizenry makes politicians of all of us.
Thank you, Tessa. Yes, I was getting a little bit edgy because, we said to each other, we don't need until 1 o'clock. We can wrap up at 12, but here we are. I think we're still having the discussions. I can't take all the hands, but I've got some hands waiting in the wings, and I'm going to start with the online. So, Johanna, if you can just give us an overview of what's coming from our online participants.
Thank you. So online's been bursting with some activity. I'm going to try and condense the questions into just a couple of points. So the first one is about whether or not our politicians has become a liability. The question is, the problem has been diagnosed very well and analysis has been provided, but how do we then resolve these problems? Is it correct that we have professionalized politics to a point that it's becoming a commodity? And the other point then is very little was said about the weaknesses or the strengths of our party system and its ability to cope with the challenges discussed during this webinar. And then the last point is, it seems like citizens have abdicated their power to the politicians. But how do we revitalize, how do we reactivate citizen activism? How do we make them more engaged or even interested again in politics and participating? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Johanna. Just picking up quickly on the second point of the party system and linking it to intergovernmental relations. As the question came, do we need to rethink our system entirely, and can we still go on with the compromises that were put in the Constitution in the early 90s? It's an interesting phenomenon if we look at the role of provinces, and Tessa, you raised it. And Minister, you may or may not enjoy this comment, but the ANC was never a great fan of provinces, during the negotiations. I mean, that's a fact. However, when the ANC came into power and started realigning its internal party political structure to government, it actually federalized its internal party structure, because now we have provinces in the ANC. And they have become very strong forces. A couple of years ago, there was a Premier League within the ANC, which was a group of... It takes us back to those years. So it's interesting how intergovernmental relations and the internal structuring of political parties has a very important effect on one another. Anyway, I just thought I'd pick up on that point. Okay, so finally, the questions here. You've been very, very patient. So the gentleman at the back, over to you, sir.
Thank you, and thanks to the panelists. My name is Lepopa Tomashike. I'm a researcher into these issues and a staunch student of DDM. Quick ones, the district development model. Is the problem with the structure or the implementation, or is it lack of understanding or lack of political will? And I'm asking this question because I was fortunate enough to work at the DDM. And some of the issues that were said was that a problem with the DDM was that it was not legislated. And people who support it say it is under Chapter 3 and Chapter 7 of the Constitution. But then if you read that chapter, which is a point of contention, it says an act of parliament must establish or provide for structures and institutions to promote and facilitate intergovernmental relations. And those who are against the DDM saying it is nothing but a presidential decree, which might be challenged. So that's one thing. And if we go to the issue of it being legislated, there's a question of the capacity building, which the minister referred to. There's an issue of the district development model hubs. Were they ever developed? Were they capacitated? Because that's one of the issues. Maybe the last point is to say, I'm not sure whether we should be really worried about coalition government, this and this, because this is politics. I don't know how many of you remember that in Umgeni, in KwaZulu-Natal, the DA challenged the DDM, and we had a report where the ANC councillors, allegedly, I'm not sure, they supported the DA. And there was an article on polity.org.za where the author said, we welcome this move putting the interest of the people of Umgeni first, which is what the minister was saying, that whatever happens at IGR, it should be all about putting the interest of the citizens first. So I'm not sure about the issue of legislation. Do we need legislation for the DDM? Have we capacitated the district development model hubs? And do we have success stories? Thank you.
Over to you, sir.
Okay. Minister, thank you for your input. It's very intellectually stimulating. My question is the threshold. I'm not sure whether the circus of these coalitions will change after the elections. The threshold for me is a bit low, 1%. I think we should make politics more expensive. At least 2%. I mean, the previous mayor of Joburg, one of his qualities was, well, you must learn to dress and you must learn to speak. You can't have that. You must have somebody who's really serious about politics, and you can't have somebody who's got 0.1% and he rules a country. He rules one of the richest provinces. I'm not sure where he is now and so on. That's my question. The other question is this: is that accountability? Perhaps it is not your domain, but if somebody is so arrogant and say, you know what, I'm here to eat for the next 5 years. I mean, I'm not going to call names, mention the names and so on. You should at least tell that person, you're at the wrong place. You're not here to eat, you're here to service. Thank you.
Jenica, you had your hand up earlier? And I think then we have to wrap it up because we are running out of time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Should I stand up? It's not necessary. Thank you so much for the lovely presentations. Prof, thanks for that presentation on IGR relations. I do have a few comments that I forgot now, but it's coming back as I'm speaking. Okay, so I wanted to touch on Tessa's presentation pertaining to the ward committee. I do have a NGO that I registered just for purposes of using my knowledge of local government to assist my community. So we serve on the ward committee. And some of the issues that I found there is that I take that point that these structures need to be depoliticized, because my experience was that even though I found myself in a structure with ordinary people from our home communities, I thought I would be in a position to use my knowledge to take the sub-council further, but I see that there's a reluctance to learn when it comes to the sub-council, a reluctance to change the status quo, a reluctance to innovate by using the additional capacity that would come into a ward. I also find that I see this differentiation across the ward committees when it comes to remuneration. Having read 70 IDPs, I see that in KZN, for example, they would earn 1,500 Rand per month, those ward committees. But in our case, the members receive 350 Rand per month. And then they expect people to host public participation meetings and all of that. So there's a lot of practical challenges that there is. And also, when it comes to the IDPs, I've applied my mind to the IDPs in the 70 young councils, and my finding was that only in less than 10 of those IDPs, I would see that there was actually input from ward committees about the challenges on the ground. And my understanding would be is that ward committees are also responsible for having their own sort of mini IDP that then feeds into the larger. So in the context where that is missing, it creates that problems for practice, and it takes us back to Prof. Chigwata's writings about bottom-up governance. We don't really see that because of these practical constraints that we encounter in practice. Then also with regards to the IGR relations, I question to what extent is our current IGR systems actually functional? If we look at how, the challenges around electricity, I think Prof. Chigwata can come in here. We found several cases in which parties go to courts. We know that with a certification judgment where they stated that our system isn't really adversarial, they must make use of the IGR systems. But then I question why then are organs of state going to courts? And that is because the IGR systems that we have currently is, I don't know, I can't say I'm not a practitioner in that regard, but it appears to me that there are practical challenges there when it comes to, and it's ironic because these are actually structures that's established to regulate conflict and resolve conflicts, but it appears that when there is conflict, parties exit that mechanism to approach the courts. So it makes me think a bit further about our separation of powers. To what extent is the executive and the legislature then functional if parties and organs of state are defecting to the judiciary? And in this context, then, it becomes especially more important for our judiciary to be independent. And I think that is one of the strengths we still have, that we are able to rely on our judiciary, especially in a time where we find ourselves now, that we are in a time of reform. And we see our judiciary exercising oversight in that regard. We can see it with the One Nation movement. You refer to the independent case, the case concerning independent councillors and what they term as a threshold pertaining to the elections. So in terms of the SIR's input also with regards to thresholds, that case is actually very enlightening because it tells us the different ways in which thresholds can be used, not necessarily only when it comes to the parliamentary setting, but also outside of that, because that threshold is, like Tessa alerted to, that threshold is merely for getting the signatures in order to stand as an independent candidate, not yet to be voted into. So how we look at thresholds, I think, we can look a bit deeper in that regard also. Thank you.
All right, now let's close the round of questions, and we're going to go to our panel for their parting shots, and I'm going to ask them to be disciplined and give short responses and try to cover the questions. We've got quite a few interesting points about have we over-professionalized politics, the party system and IGR, DDM, the issue of thresholds. It's very difficult nowadays to have a meeting related to governance where the issue of thresholds doesn't come in one way or another. Is the 1% too low? And then ward committees, IDPs, and whether our IGR system is functional. Just your parting shots. Maybe we can start with Tessa and then we work our way back to Tinashe.
Sure. So let's start with thresholds. So the thing about thresholds in a PR-only system is that it eliminates franchise from too many people, right? And it also prioritizes parties, especially parties who are able to amass more resources. So the more people you can reach, the higher your chances of your ability to get threshold. But it also means that you can leave out people who you don't even pay attention to, and that just takes their sense of franchise will disappear the higher the threshold is. But there is innate threshold in a constituency-based model. and you can build in innate threshold. So when we elect ward councillors, there's an innate threshold in the first past the post system, because the threshold is the person with the most votes. Done, right? So I think that when we look at the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, we look at the Motlanthe report, part of the motivation around a mixed system is to keep the PR system in a way that it gives that collective voice and the ability to act as a collective, but that you then introduce more opportunities for constituency-based voting so that you minimize, you make the constituency or the voting pool smaller in places so you give enough weight to as many votes as possible. So I mean, first past the post is not ideal, I think, on its own for all purposes. But I think in a context where you're trying to really give as many people a voice as possible, as what our multi-party system demands of us to do, I think that's part of the motivation for a mixed system, and I think thresholds start to become important for that. And that's part of what was debated in now that we have the 3 ballots. By the way, everyone, we have 3 ballots this year. Please tell everyone you know we have 3 ballots this year, and we're voting twice for national parliament this year. One of those ballots is for parties only, the other ballot is independents and parties, but they're both national parliament ballots. Really, really important that we get this out. But I think what we missed in doing that, especially that now that we have independents as individuals and parties on the same ballot, is that we're going to do more math to get threshold, as opposed to just doing it first past the post. And had we done that, you build for 200 seats, a threshold that doesn't make anybody's votes discarded, right? So I do think we've missed the trick there, and I think it's because parties are too scared to let go of the power they have over MPs and MPs' ability to vote. The party line is being protected at the expense of the franchise of the vote. The second one is related to that, because the internal democracy question. We don't ask questions about parties' internal democracy. And the question about particularly consequence management within parties. Parties just do whatever they want. Their consequence management is up to themselves. So we see Kenneth Meshre, 30 years later, still party leader. On the basis of what? But we're not asking the question about having more rigorous, more innovative, more democratic practices within parties. So for me, it's a no-brainer that needs to be dealt with, and that then goes to the careerism question. And the careerism question is also a problem of the broader electorate and communities. The idea that politics is for a select few people is one we have to completely dispel. But the only way you dispel that is by more people who have no interest in being career politicians raising their hand for 5 years and then exiting to go and do something else. But we don't have that in our minds. You think once a politician, always a politician, I have to give up my life for this thing forever. Especially younger people. Younger people need to get involved younger so they can exit and then go live their lives. Make your contribution and move on. That's a political culture issue that I think we can solve for, but we're not doing that. And then the last thing is active citizenry. Again, fear is a big part of the reason why people don't connect their active citizenry to politics. And it's one of the things that has been, again, haunting me for the last few years. And so people are doing their active citizenry, targeted either on their own or towards government as an amorphous thing, because anytime it feels like you are actually engaging the actual politician, people fear for their actual lives. It's becoming more and more common that even in NGO spaces where you're dealing with an issue like hunger, or people say, I'm too afraid to speak up because of the political threat that comes with this. And we have to start addressing that more. In other countries, in other African countries particularly, there's a lot more focus on political violence because it's perpetrated against very big figures. So the opposition leader. In South Africa, the opposition leaders are fairly safe. I can assure you that. But it's the activists that are in communities on the ground that feel most vulnerable to political violence. And I think it's something we haven't thought of enough.
Thank you. Just 2 points. The one on thresholds, it's not 1%, it's 1/400th of the votes cast for the National Assembly. And that means 0.25%, 50,000 votes if we have got 20 million people voting. It goes lower even that. Previously, a party with 0.18% of the votes got in. So we're going to have this greater number of smaller parties getting in, and the system is going now also with individual members are going to get in. So we can have fractured National Assembly, which is going to be more difficult to put a coalition together. So the system allows us for a fairly unstable one. So the first thing is, obviously, you must look at thresholds, and already I think that's the case in a local government, but it also goes to nationally. Second one is looking at parties. I totally agree that the electoral system must change. And in 1996, we wrote a book called Voting in 1999 to make sure that we have a mixed system. And political parties are so embedded in PR, it serves their function, serves their purposes, and you have not moved an inch on that. Because what is greater for a political party just to haul out a list, and that becomes the vote, and they control their members. For citizens, and the point Tessa was making, is we don't know who is on the list. So at least if I are expected to vote for a list, I must know who the people are on that list. Not only a name, but can we demand that we know a short CV? What are the leadership positions? What are the education? What are anything that recommend that person on the list? So I think the electoral system needs a tremendous overhaul, and that entails how we treat parties, and parties treat us as voters. Thanks.
Prof, I kept a clip of myself of 2019 or 2018. I was the president of SARChl, and I concluded the conference by saying, we are approaching 2021 elections of local government, and I'm challenging every political party to prioritize education. I got a backlash, a huge one. I still have that clip. When I'm thinking about difficult days of my life, I replay it and I'm like, wow, what the hell was I thinking? But I still believe in it, and it's a story for another day. And not only at local government, but for me, specifically for local government. If you are a councillor in the city of Johannesburg, your manage is nothing less than 70 billion in your hands. So there has got to be a head and a tail there to do it right. And I insist it is very different than when you are an MPL or you are an MP when you are at local government. You directly, as a councillor, manages on a month-to-month basis versus an MP. How are the affairs of your citizens in this ward and in this jurisdiction of a municipality differently than how? My second comment, and I promise I'm going to be short than Tessa. MP's account. Tessa, in fact, your tax pays MPs 109 days in the 365 for them to be in communities. Well, yes, you may be saying you are not doing it, you are not holding them accountable. In fact, our system, I insist, on structures left no stone unturned. The question should be different. Maybe why is the system not working? There are 350 constituency offices in the country paid for by your tax. Yes, there are even in your tax in parliament allowance to each and every political party that is represented in parliament, elected by you, to use the 109 days
So when they say Parliament is in recess, it's not a holiday. It is a constituency week and period. In the 365, it amounts to 110, 100, depending on the calendar of Parliament, but it's never less than 109 days. It's a story for another day. There is an accountability framework and response back for everybody else. We may not be utilizing it. The part on threshold, Prof, dealt with it very well. And my last comment is on the institutionalization and the regulation. Maybe you missed it, and it must be a discussion from another day. I'll actually even tell you when I did that. I circulated a gazette, so which means you didn't participate in it, on the institutionalization of DDM. 4 August 2023. So we were, my premier, Mwakura Matlodi, used to say, Walala Wasala. It is a Walala Wasala type. What we can then do is to bring it to academia and say, is our thought process valid? Because there is never everything that is closed, cast in stone. It has to be revived. But we opted for regulations than a law. So that's the first distinction which we made, and at least I can be held accountable for that, is that you can't legislate and legislate and legislate, but you could rather try to put a framework on how to regulate on it so that you could be able to create the Bible that I'm talking about and take the scenario of the past, that the destination is this and who is supposed to be the driver towards that story. You will check on it.
All right, I will just, I think, in the interest of time, just address 2 issues. The first one is the issue of litigation around electricity issues that Janika made reference to. So this is the issue of money, so you understand why people end up going in court. And in the local government bulletin, I think we've covered it fairly well, where we have traced the dispute between ESCOM and municipalities around debts. And I think this is a clear example where we are saying that there may be issues in the IGRA system that needs to be looked at, because when you see then ESCOM going to court or municipalities taking ESCOM to court, it means that the IGRA system as they are now, the first step is not satisfied or succeeded in solving the problem. But we must also understand that the Constitution as well as the Intergovernmental Relations Act also anticipate that in other cases, there may be a few cases that have to go to court. So it uses the terminology that you could approach court as a last resort, so which means it's a mechanism that is there to solve intergovernmental disputes. Then my last issue is on the issue of which Tessa referred to, the role and relevance of provinces. I think this is an issue that has been on the cards for quite some time. I remember, I think the ANC came up with some position papers as far back as 2008, 2009, on whether the provinces are still relevant and looking at the kind of role that they play. So my brief comment on that would be that it's easier to create institutions than to get rid of them. You can imagine now there's a strong provincial base across all political parties. So you can imagine to come up to say that let's really look at whether we still need provinces or not. That's going to raise a lot of issues. But for me, from an intergovernmental relations perspective, the system is so intertwined. So if you look at provinces, they play directly in how the NCOP is constituted. So when you talk about the relevance of the provinces, you must also look at the NCOP. They play a critical role in the composition of the Budget Council. They play a critical role in the composition of the Judicial Service Commission, because some members of they are there. So the system is so intertwined that when you talk about relevance of one institution, you need to look at the entire system as a whole. And on that, I would part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tinashe. Thank you. So yeah, we have our favorite topics, right? ward committees, thresholds, the role of provinces. They're always, no matter what agenda you formulate, they always come up. When we talk about provinces, I once made an input, I think it was at an anniversary event. The debate about the role of provinces reminds me of the song by The Clash, should I stay or should I go? Because if I stay, it will be trouble, but if I go, it will be double. So we're never sure what, and it will remain a debate for as long as we live. As I don't see us making any major changes to that soon. But that's just my own personal view. But raising the question is critically important because it forces us to reflect on the functionality of our intergovernmental relations system. So I think you'll agree this was a rich and lively debate. We went slightly outside of the discussion on cooperative governance at some point. I think we were somewhere else, but it's fine. It's all related and all important. And besides, this will not be the last conversation that we will host on the issue of multi-level government, intergovernmental relations. We're going to see what comes out of the elections and actually tailor our next conversation to, what are the burning issues? So in the words of the minister, a story for another day. There will be a story for another day. We'll hopefully organize more of these. So I want to thank our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. For really, gripping us with their inputs and their responses and engagement. The enthusiasm, the passion, and the wisdom was there for everyone to engage with. Thank you, Minister. Sorry that you missed your Cabinet Committee meeting. We will henceforth choose Tuesday or Thursday. Just to make sure we can call on you again. Or it was wonderful to have you. Tessa, thanks for traveling all the way here and being part of this debate and really bringing fantastic, important issues to the discussion. And of course, my colleagues Tinashe and Nico, thanks ever so much for your contributions. Thanks to the organizers, Laura there at the back, Johandri, Kay, our audiovisual assistants, all perfect, well done. Thanks so much for putting this together. Kurtley, who's also there at the back, thanks for assisting and for being part of organizing this event. And thanks to all of you. Thanks for our participants online. We had quite a wealth of participants online, more than 60, so that's fantastic. So we were really broadcasting this discussion onto the internet, and it will be recorded and put online, the recording of it, so it will be available for as long as the internet exists, and that's probably going to be a very long time. Thank you. You've been very committed, very patient. It's been a long haul. You must be hungry, thirsty. There's something to eat and drink outside. And thanks very much for coming. Travel safe and hope to see you again. Thanks, everyone.